7 women walked off that mountain before the first snow ever touched her boots. 7 times, Elias Turner stood at the edge of his own porch and watched a stranger he'd paid for disappear down a trail that didn't forgive hesitation. By the time the 8th letter came, he wasn't hoping anymore. He was finishing something. What he didn't know, what nobody up on that ridge could have known, was that the woman stepping off that last wagon wasn't running from a city or chasing a dream. She was carrying a secret that would either save him or bury him deeper than the mountain ever could. Stay with me until the very end, because this one turns in a way you won't see coming. Hit that like button and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. The 7th one left on a Tuesday. Elias Turner remembered the day of the week because he'd been splitting firewood when he heard the wagon wheels, and Tuesday was the day he always split wood. Routine was the only thing that kept a man sane up here. You did the same things in the same order, and the mountain didn't get a chance to surprise you. Her name had been Adeline, or Adelaide. He couldn't remember now, and that was the worst part, that he'd spent $14 and 6 months of letters on a woman whose name he couldn't hold in his head past the second week. She'd lasted 4 days. 4 days of her crying at the wash basin, flinching every time the wind hit the cabin, picking at her food like the stew had offended her personally. 4 days of Elias sleeping on the floor by the stove because she'd locked herself in the bedroom with a chair wedged under the handle, as if he were the thing she needed protection from, and not the weather, not the wolves, not the 40-mile stretch of nothing between his cabin and the nearest town. On the 4th morning, he'd come in from the woodshed and found her bundled in every coat she owned, sitting at the table with her carpet bag at her feet. "I need you to take me down," she'd said. She wouldn't look at him. "Today. Now, if you can. There's weather coming." "I don't care." "You will." She'd looked up then, and her eyes had been red but dry, and she'd said something he kept thinking about for weeks afterward. She'd said, "Mr. Turner, I would rather freeze to death in that wagon than spend one more night in this house listening to you breathe." He hadn't known what to say to that. He still didn't. He'd hitched the wagon and taken her down himself, because the hired man from Caldwell's general store only came up once a month and there wasn't time to wait. The trip took 11 hours. She didn't speak. He didn't either. When they reached the stagecoach station in Hollow Creek, she'd climbed down without letting him help her, paid for her own ticket with money he hadn't known she had, and walked into the depot without looking back. He'd stood there in the cold mud with the reins in his hands and watched the door swing shut behind her. Then he'd turned the wagon around and driven the 11 hours home in the dark. That was 3 months ago. Now it was November, and the snow had come early, and Elias Turner was splitting wood on a Tuesday afternoon, trying very hard not to think about the letter sitting on his kitchen table. Bonk. The cabin sat in a clearing on the eastern slope of Crowfoot Ridge, tucked against the pines like a thing trying not to be noticed. He'd built it himself at 22, alone, over the course of one summer and one very long autumn. The logs were hand-notched, the roof was cedar shake. The stone chimney he'd laid up course by course from rocks he'd dragged out of the creek bed with a borrowed mule. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't meant to be. It was meant to last, and 10 years on, it had. The mountain, though. The mountain was pretty in the way a knife was pretty. You could admire the edge all you wanted, but you didn't forget what it was for. Elias brought the axe down. The round of lodgepole pine split clean, the two halves falling away from each other like they'd been waiting to be freed. He bent, set up the next round, swung again. The rhythm was the only thing in his head that wasn't the letter. He was a tall man, a little past 6 feet, built the way men get built when their work is the kind that doesn't let them soften. Dark hair, cut short because he did it himself with a straight razor and couldn't manage anything fancier. A beard he kept trimmed, not out of vanity, but because ice caught in a long one, and ice against the skin was how a man lost a face. He had gray eyes that most people who met him described later as cold, though the truth was that they weren't cold so much as used up. Like a window somebody had stopped looking out of. He was 32 years old. He'd been alone on this mountain in one form or another for 18 of those years. The axe came down again. The wood split. He'd been 11 when his mother died of the fever that came through the valley that spring. He'd been 14 when his father walked out to check the trap lines one January morning and didn't walk back. They'd found the old man a week later, half a mile from the cabin, sitting upright against a spruce trunk with his rifle across his lap and his eyes open, frozen solid. No wound, no struggle. He just sat down to rest and never stood up again. Elias had buried him next to the mother, in the rocky patch of ground behind the woodshed where nothing grew. He'd been 14. He dug the grave himself because there was nobody else on the mountain, and he didn't know how to ask for help, didn't know who he would have asked. After that, it had just been him, and the cabin, and the work. The work never stopped. That was the thing nobody in town understood when they called him strange, or surly, or, his favorite, that mountain man of Caldwell's. The work never stopped. Wood had to be split. Meat had to be smoked. The roof had to be patched before the snow came, and the chimney had to be cleaned before the creosote caught, and the traps had to be run every third day in winter because furs froze stiff and ruined if you left them. And the horse had to be fed, and the chickens had to be fed, and the goats had to be fed, and the fences had to be checked, and the spring had to be kept from freezing over, and the lamp oil had to be rationed, and the flour had to be kept dry, and the work never stopped. He'd figured out by the time he was 16 that a man couldn't do it alone forever. Not and stay whole. Not and stay a man, and not just a pair of hands attached to an empty head. He'd started writing letters at 24. The broker in Denver was a woman named Mrs. Halverson, who ran her business out of the second floor of a millinery shop. Elias had never met her. He'd only ever seen her handwriting, tidy, slanted, brown ink on cream-colored paper. She charged $8 a match and took another $2 when the woman arrived. Her letters always began, "Dear Mr. Turner," and they always ended "Yours in good faith, H. Halverson." And between those two bookends, she described women the way a stockman might describe heifers. Age 26, of German extraction, robust constitution, plain features, willing. That had been the first one. Gerda. She'd stayed 2 weeks. After Gerda, there had been Constance, who'd stayed 9 days. After Constance, there had been Mary Beth, who'd stayed 3 weeks, the longest of any of them, before she'd started laughing at odd moments, laughing at nothing. And one morning, Elias had woken up and found her standing barefoot in the snow outside the cabin, just standing there, staring at the trees. He'd taken her down the next day. Mrs. Halverson had written back a very stiff letter explaining that Mary Beth's constitution had perhaps been overstated. After Mary Beth, there had been Josephine, and after Josephine, there had been a woman whose name Elias genuinely could not recall anymore. And after her, there had been Ruth, and then Adeline or Adelaide, and that was 7. 7 women. 7 wagons down the mountain. 7 times he'd stood on the porch and watched a back get smaller and smaller against the snow and thought, this is the last time. I'm not doing this again. And then, 3 months after the last one, a letter had come. He hadn't written for it. He hadn't asked. It was sitting on the kitchen table now, and he'd been avoiding the kitchen since breakfast. The axe came down one more time, and then Elias straightened up and pressed the heel of his hand against his lower back. The light was going. He could feel the cold starting to climb up under his coat, the way it did when the sun dropped behind the ridge. Not a gradual thing, not a fade, just a wall of it coming down all at once. He stacked the split wood on the sled, tied it off, and dragged it to the lean-to beside the cabin. The bay horse, Job, watched him from the corral with the patient half-attention of an animal that had long since decided his man was not going to do anything interesting. Elias scratched the horse's nose on his way past. "Don't look at me like that," he said. "You eat too." Job blew warm breath into his palm. Inside the cabin, the stove had burned down to coals. Elias fed it 2 sticks of pine and one of the oak splits he was rationing, then hung his coat and his hat on the pegs by the door. He washed his hands in the basin. The water was cold enough that his knuckles ached. The letter was where he'd left it. He'd opened it that morning and read it twice, and then set it down and not looked at it again. He looked at it now. "Dear Mr. Turner, it has been some months since our last correspondence, and I confess I had not expected to write to you again, given the circumstances of our previous arrangements. However, I find myself in possession of a rather unusual candidate, and I am writing to you first before any of my other gentlemen, because I believe she may be suited to your particular situation in a way my previous candidates were not. Her name is Marisol Vega. She is 29 years of age. She was raised on a sheep ranch in the San Juan Valley, and she has been supporting herself as a cook and housekeeper in Pueblo for the last 6 years. She came to me of her own accord, not through any agent or family arrangement. She has read the full description of your homestead and your situation. I gave her, as I always do, every reason to reconsider. She did not reconsider. I will be frank, Mr. Turner. She is not what I would call pretty, in the sense that our previous correspondents have preferred. She is not young. She is not delicate. She does not write a flattering letter, but she strikes me as a woman who does not walk into a room she cannot walk out of. I will send her at my own expense if you agree. If she does not suit, or if you do not suit her, I will cover the return fare as well. I have not made this offer before. I do not expect to make it again. Please respond at your convenience. Yours in good faith, H. Halverson. He read it a third time, standing at the kitchen table with his coat still dripping snowmelt onto the floor. Then he sat down. He didn't feel hope. That was the thing he'd noticed that morning, and the thing he noticed again now. Somewhere between the fourth woman and the seventh, the hope had stopped. He didn't know exactly when. He just knew that reading the letter now, he wasn't thinking maybe this one. He was thinking this is the last one. Not because Mrs. Halverson's description had moved him, not because the name Marisol Vega meant anything to him, just because he was 32 years old and he had split his last piece of firewood of the day, and he was sitting alone in a cabin he had built with his own two hands. And he had realized somewhere on the walk back from the woodshed that he could not do this one more time. Not the marriage, the hoping. He got up, went to the drawer under the sideboard, and pulled out a sheet of paper and the pencil he kept wrapped in oilcloth. He sat back down. He wrote, Mrs. Halverson, send her. He thought for a long time. Then he wrote, this is the last one. Whether she stays or she doesn't, I am done writing after this. Please accept this as notice. E. Turner. He folded the letter. He sealed it with the stub of red wax he kept in a tin. He addressed it. Then he stood up, put on his coat again, and walked it out to the shed where the mail pouch hung waiting for Caldwell's man to come through on his next run. When he came back inside, the cabin was quiet in the way it always was, and he stood in the middle of the room for a minute with his hands at his sides, looking at nothing, and then he went and fed the stove. Caldwell's man came through 9 days later, and 3 weeks after that, a letter came back. It was not from Mrs. Halverson. It was written on the back of a page torn out of an almanac in pencil, in a hand that slanted hard to the right and did not waste any space. Mr. Turner, I will be at the Hollow Creek station on the 14th. If you cannot come down for me, write and say so, and I will find my own way up. I can ride. I can drive a wagon. I can walk if I have to. Do not send a neighbor. I would prefer to meet you first. Marisol Vega. Elias read it twice, standing in the doorway of the shed with the mail pouch still in his hand, and then he read it a third time, and he found that he was smiling, not wide, but at the corner of his mouth, and he did not entirely know why. The 14th was 6 days away. The weather turned on the 11th. It came in from the northwest, a slate wall of it that Elias watched climb over the ridge with the kind of attention a man pays to something that might kill him. He brought the goats in from the upper pasture. He doubled the rope on the woodshed roof. He chopped a hole through the ice on the spring and covered it with a weighted tarp so it wouldn't seal over before morning. He fed Job an extra measure of oats and rubbed him down and checked his shoes. Then the snow started. It snowed for 2 days without stopping. By the second evening, the drifts against the north side of the cabin were up past the windowsill, and Elias was shoveling a path to the woodshed every 6 hours just to keep it open. The wind came down off the peak in gusts that made the cabin creak in its joints, and the stovepipe moan like a sick animal, and he lay in his bed at night listening to it and thinking, she's going to be on the stage. If she's on the stage, she's going to be stuck somewhere. If she's stuck somewhere, she's going to turn around. He surprised himself by minding. Not badly. Just a small dull minding at the back of his chest, the way a man minds a tooth that has started to ache but hasn't started to scream yet. On the morning of the 14th, he woke before light and stood at the window in his long underwear, looking out at the clearing. The snow had stopped sometime in the night. The sky over the ridge was the color of old tin. The cold, when he opened the door to check the thermometer he kept nailed to the porch post, was bad, 18 below, and the wind not done yet. He hitched Job to the sleigh instead of the wagon. The wagon would not have made it past the second switchback. Then he put on everything he owned, 2 shirts, a wool sweater, the sheepskin coat, a scarf, a fur hat, and the heavy mittens with the canvas shells. And he took a jug of coffee and 2 wool blankets and a buffalo robe, and he headed down the mountain for Hollow Creek. The trail was bad. In places, the snow had drifted over the track entirely, and he had to get down and lead Job through on foot, the horse blowing great clouds of steam and lifting his hooves high like a show animal in a parade. Twice Elias thought about turning around. Both times he didn't. He reached Hollow Creek just before noon. The town was not much. A string of low buildings along a frozen creek, smoke going straight up from every chimney because there wasn't a breath of wind down in the hollow. The stagecoach station was at the north end, a long, low building with a wide porch, and there was a stage already there, unhitched, the horses stabled. That meant it had come in. Elias tied Job to the rail. His legs felt strange after the long sit in the cold, stiff, unfamiliar, as if they belonged to somebody else. He stamped them a couple of times. He pushed open the depot door. The room was warm. There was a pot-bellied stove in the center and a long bench against one wall and a counter with a telegraph key at the far end, and there were 2 people in it, the station agent, a bald man named Peebles, whom Elias knew slightly, and a woman in a dark wool coat sitting on the bench near the stove with a carpet bag at her feet and her gloved hands resting one on top of the other in her lap. She looked up when he came in. She was not pretty. Mrs. Halverson had not lied. She had a broad, square face, the kind of face that belonged on somebody who worked for a living. Her hair was dark and pulled back tight under a plain wool bonnet. Her nose had been broken at some point and not set quite straight. Her mouth was wide and unsmiling. Her skin was brown from the sun, browner than any of the other 6, browner than Elias himself. And there were 2 faint lines at the corners of her eyes that suggested she'd spent a lot of her life squinting into a long distance. What Mrs. Halverson had not mentioned, because Mrs. Halverson had not known how to describe it, was her stillness. She sat on that bench like a thing that had sat in a lot of places and was prepared to sit in a lot more. She did not fidget. She did not fuss with her hands. She did not stand up when Elias came in. She simply raised her eyes to his face and waited. Elias took his hat off. "Miss Vega?" "Mr. Turner." Her voice was low. There was a faint accent in it, a softness at the edges of certain vowels, and he realized after a second that it was Spanish, or had been once, rounded down by years of something else. "You got in all right." "We were a day late." She nodded once toward the window. "The weather." "I figured." He didn't know what else to say. He stood there in the middle of the depot with his hat in one hand and his mittens in the other, and he felt, for the first time in a long time, uncertain. Peebles, behind the counter, coughed into his fist in a way that suggested he was enjoying himself and trying to hide it. The woman, Marisol, watched Elias for another moment. Then she stood up. She was not tall, maybe 5'4", but the way she stood up had nothing to do with height. "Do you have a sleigh?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Is the trail passable?" "It's bad, but it's passable." She nodded. "All right." She bent, picked up her carpet bag. It was heavier than it looked. He could tell by the way her shoulders set under the weight of it, and walked past him toward the door. "I'd like to go now, if that suits you. I don't want to sit here any longer." Peebles coughed again. Elias ignored him. "It suits me," he said. "There's a cafe across the way. You could eat first." "I ate on the stage." "It's 4 hours up." "I know." She had the door open now. The cold came in around her like a second presence. "I'd rather be 4 hours cold than 4 hours putting it off." Elias looked at her. She looked back at him. It was the first time a woman had walked out of that depot ahead of him instead of behind him. And it was the first time he had not felt, somewhere in the bottom of his stomach, the slow spreading sick of knowing he was about to disappoint her. He put his hat back on. "All right," he said. "Let's go." The ride up was slow. He'd brought the buffalo robe for her, and the 2 blankets, and he made her take all of them. She didn't argue. She tucked herself into the corner of the sleigh with the carpet bag between her knees and the robe pulled up to her chin, and she watched the country go past them with an attention that he eventually realized was not curiosity, but assessment. She was looking at the land the way a man looks at a horse he's thinking about buying, checking the legs, checking the teeth. For the first hour, they did not speak. The only sounds were Job's breathing and the sleigh runners hissing through the snow, and now and then the dry crack of a branch giving up under its load and falling somewhere in the trees. When they'd climbed past the second switchback and the country opened up into the long meadow that ran along the base of the ridge, she said, without turning her head, "How many have there been?" He didn't pretend not to understand. 7. Before me. Yes, ma'am. How long did the longest one stay? 3 weeks. Why did she leave? Elias thought about Mary Beth, standing barefoot in the snow, staring at the trees. He thought about how to say it. She wasn't built for it, he said finally. Marisol nodded, once, as if that matched something she had already suspected. And the shortest? 4 days. Why? He let out a breath. It made a cloud in front of his face. He watched the cloud drift forward and break apart. She was afraid of me. Marisol turned her head then. She looked at him. It was the first time since they'd left the depot that she had looked at him directly, and her eyes, he noticed, were almost black. And they did not flinch and did not soften and did not do any of the things that other women's eyes had done when they'd first really looked at him and realized what they had signed up for. "Were you a thing to be afraid of?" she said. "No." He kept his eyes on the trail. "But I understand why she was." There was a long silence. Then Marisol said, "All right." That was all. Just all right. And she turned her head back to the country, and she did not ask him any more questions for the rest of the ride. They reached the cabin a little after 4. The light was already failing. The wind had picked up again, and Elias could feel it pushing at the back of his neck as he guided Job up the final slope into the clearing. The cabin sat there, low and dark, with a thread of smoke still rising from the chimney where the stove had been banked that morning. Behind it, the ridge rose up into the cloud. To the east, the pines stood black against the graying sky. He stopped the sleigh at the porch. He climbed down. His legs nearly went out from under him. 4 hours in the cold had done something to them, and he had to grab the rail to keep his feet. He hoped she hadn't seen. She had seen. He could tell by the small, quiet way she didn't comment. He went around to help her out. She let him take her hand, which surprised him. He'd expected her to refuse, but she didn't let him take the carpet bag. She carried that herself. They went up the porch together. He opened the door. The cabin was cold, not freezing. The stove had kept a little heat in, but it was that deep, settled cold of a place that had been without a living presence all day, and he saw her notice it, saw her eyes go around the room, the table, the 2 chairs, the rough sideboard, the stove, the wash basin, the curtain that separated the bedroom from the main room, the one small window that faced south, the hooks on the wall where his coats hung, the rifle on the pegs above the door, and take the measure of it all in maybe 6 seconds. She set her carpet bag down by the door. "Where do you want me to sleep?" she said. The question hit him sideways. He had not thought about it exactly, because he had not let himself think about it. He had spent 6 weeks not thinking about it. "The bedroom," he said. "I'll sleep out here, on the floor by the stove." She looked at him. She looked at the curtain. She looked back at him. "For how long?" "As long as you want." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "That's not an answer, Mr. Turner. It's the only one I've got." She studied his face. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, or at least to not dissatisfy her, because after a moment she nodded. "All right," she said. "For now." She took off her coat. She hung it on the peg next to his. Then she rolled up the sleeves of her dress. The dress was plain dark wool, and the sleeves were already a little worn at the elbows. And she walked past him to the stove, and she opened the firebox and looked inside, and she said without turning around, "Do you have kindling split?" "In the box by the door." "All right." She knelt down. She started to build the fire up. Elias stood in the middle of his own cabin and watched a woman he had met 4 hours and 11 miles ago kneel at his stove and feed it wood with hands that did not shake and did not fumble, and he felt something move in his chest that he did not have a name for and did not particularly want to name. He turned away. He went back out into the cold to unhitch Job. She did not cry that first night. She did not lock herself in the bedroom. She did not sit at the table and pick at her food. She ate what he cooked, venison stew with potatoes, which was what he'd have eaten anyway, and she ate it efficiently, and when she was finished, she stood up and took both of their plates to the basin and started to wash them. "You don't have to do that," Elias said. "Your first night." "I know I don't have to." She kept washing. He watched her for a second, then he got up and dried. They did not speak while they worked. When the plates were done, she wiped the table and he fed the stove one more time, and then they stood there, the two of them in the small yellow circle of lamplight, and he realized he had no idea what to do next. She did. "I'm going to bed," she said. "It's been a long day." "All right." She looked at the floor by the stove, then at him. "You'll be warm enough? I've slept out here plenty." "That's not what I asked." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. He didn't know where it had come from. "I'll be warm enough," he said. "Go on." She nodded. She went to the curtain. She paused with her hand on the edge of it, and she did not turn around, but she said quietly to the wall, "Good night, Mr. Turner." "Good night, Miss Vega." "Marisol," she said. "If we're going to live in the same house, Marisol." "Elias. Elias." The curtain fell closed behind her. He stood there for a long time, listening to the small sounds of her on the other side. The creak of the bed, the rustle of her dress being folded, the soft thump of boots being set down on the floor, and then the lamp on her side went out, and the cabin was quiet, and he was alone in the main room with the stove and the wind and his own slow, unfamiliar heartbeat. He sat down on the floor by the stove. He wrapped himself in the buffalo robe. He looked up at the ceiling. He did not think this one is going to stay. He had learned not to think that anymore. He had taught himself over 7 women in 8 years not to think that. But he thought something else, and it surprised him, and it was this. He thought that for the first time in a very long time, the cabin did not sound empty. The wind pushed against the walls. The stove ticked as it cooled. Somewhere on the far side of the curtain, a woman he did not know was breathing, slow and even, in his bed. Elias Turner closed his eyes. Outside, the snow started again. The next morning, he woke to the smell of coffee. For a second, he didn't know where he was. Then he felt the floor under his back and the stove heat against his side, and he remembered. He opened his eyes. The light coming through the window was pale and thin, the color of skimmed milk. Dawn, or just after. The curtain to the bedroom was pulled back. Marisol was at the stove with her back to him, wearing the same dark wool dress from yesterday, and an apron he didn't recognize. She must have brought it. And she was pouring water from the kettle into the coffee pot with the kind of quiet efficiency that made him think she'd been up for a while. He sat up. The buffalo robe slid off his shoulders. His back ached where it had pressed against the floorboards all night, and his neck had a crick in it that was going to take an hour to work out. She turned her head. "You're awake," she said. "You didn't have to make coffee." "I wanted coffee." "You get some too. That's not charity. That's logistics." He almost smiled. He didn't, but he almost did. He got to his feet, rolled the buffalo robe, and set it on the chair. He went to the basin and washed his face with water so cold it made his teeth hurt. When he turned back around, she'd set a tin cup on the table for him, steam rising off it in a thin line. He sat down. He drank. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, which was exactly how he liked it, and how he had not expected anyone else to make it. "Is it all right?" she said. She was still standing by the stove, watching him with that same flat, careful attention she'd given the country on the ride up. "It's good." "You don't have to lie." "I'm not." She looked at him for another second, as if checking that for truth, and then she nodded and poured herself a cup and sat down across from him. They drank in silence. Outside, a crow called from somewhere in the pines, and the wind moved through the clearing in a long, low rush that made the walls creak. After a while, she said, "What do you do first?" "In the morning." "Feed the stock. Check the traps if it's a trap day. Split wood if it's a wood day. Fix whatever broke." "Is today a trap day?" "No." "Wood day?" "I split yesterday. I'm good for a few days." "So what needs fixing?" He thought about it. The door on the chicken coops got a hinge coming loose. The fence on the upper pastures got a post that's leaning, and the chimney needs cleaning before the real cold sets in. "When's the real cold?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. She nodded. She drank her coffee, then she said, "I can do the chickens." "You don't have to." "Elias." She said his name the way somebody says a word they've been practicing. "If you tell me I don't have to every time I offer to do something, we're going to spend the whole winter having the same conversation. I know I don't have to. I'm telling you I can." He looked at her. She looked back. Her face didn't change. "All right," he said. "The screwdriver's in the shed. Third shelf, left side. The screws are in the coffee tin next to it. All right. She finished her coffee. She stood up, rinsed the cup in the basin, and went to the door. She put on her coat. He noticed it was heavy canvas, not wool, and patched at both elbows. And she pulled on a pair of men's work gloves that were too big for her hands, and she went out without saying anything else. Elias sat at the table and watched the door close behind her. Then he got up and went to see about the fence post. She fixed the hinge. He checked it that afternoon when he came back from the upper pasture, and the door swung true, and the screws were seated flush, and she'd even taken the time to rub a little lard on the hinge pin so it wouldn't squeak. It was the kind of work a man did when he knew the thing was going to have to last, and there wasn't going to be anybody coming behind him to fix it if it didn't. He found her in the cabin, kneeling on the floor by the sideboard with every pot and pan and dish he owned spread out around her in a half circle. She had a rag in one hand and a jar of lye soap in the other, and she was scrubbing the inside of his smallest pot with the kind of focus most people reserved for surgery. "What are you doing?" he said. She didn't look up. "Cleaning." "I can see that." "Then why did you ask?" He didn't have an answer for that. He took off his coat and hung it up. "They're not that dirty," he said after a second. "Yes, they are. I use them." "That doesn't mean they're not dirty." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. There was a smudge of something gray on her cheek, and her hair had come loose from the knot at the back of her neck and was hanging in a dark curl over one shoulder. "When's the last time you cleaned the coffee pot?" He thought about it. "I rinse it." "That's not what I asked." "I don't remember. I can tell." She turned back to the pot. "It's all right. I'm not saying it to make you feel bad. I'm saying it because I'm cleaning it now, and I don't want you to think I'm doing it as some kind of comment on how you've been living." "Are you?" "No." "Then why are you doing it?" She paused. She set the pot down. She wiped her hands on the rag, and then she looked up at him again, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter. "Because I don't know what else to do yet," she said, "and I'd rather do something than sit here feeling like I'm in the way." He hadn't expected that. He didn't know what he'd expected, but it wasn't that. He sat down on the chair by the table. He leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. "You're not in the way," he said. "I don't know that yet." "Well, I do." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked the pot back up and went back to scrubbing, and he sat there and watched her work. And after a while he got up and went to the stove and started putting together something for supper. The days fell into a rhythm. Not a comfortable rhythm, not yet, but a rhythm. He woke first, usually, and fed the stove. She woke second and made the coffee. They ate breakfast without talking much, bread and butter, or cornmeal mush, or the tail end of whatever meat was left from the night before. Then he went out to do the work that had to be done outside, and she stayed in and did the work that had to be done inside, and they moved around each other like two people sharing a house who had not yet learned each other's corners. She cleaned, not all at once, and not as if she were trying to prove something, but steadily, methodically, the way a person works through a problem they know is going to take time. She cleaned the dishes and the pots and the floor and the windows. She took down the curtain between the bedroom and the main room and boiled it in the big kettle and hung it outside to freeze dry. And when Elias came in that evening and saw the bedroom standing open and empty behind her, he'd felt something twist in his chest, though he couldn't have said what. "I'll put it back up when it's dry," she said, not looking at him. "It's fine. I'm not trying to—" "I know," he said. "It's fine." She'd nodded. And the next day the curtain was back up, and neither of them mentioned it again. She learned the cabin. That was the only way he could think to describe it. She learned where he kept the flour and the salt and the lamp oil. She learned which pan he used for what and which skillet had the loose handle and which of the two water buckets had the slower leak. She learned that the door stuck in the bottom left corner and you had to lift as you pulled. And she learned that the window on the south wall didn't latch all the way and had to be propped with a wedge. And she learned that the third floorboard from the stove creaked when you stepped on it, and the fifth one didn't creak, but it rocked. She didn't ask him about any of it. She just watched and remembered and adjusted. On the fourth day she was there, he came in from chopping a hole in the ice on the spring and found her standing on a chair he hadn't known she'd moved, reaching up to the top shelf of the sideboard where he kept the things he didn't use often, extra candles, a sewing kit his mother had left behind, a box of cartridges for the rifle. "What are you looking for?" he said. "Vinegar," she said. "For the windows. Do you have any?" "Top shelf. Far back. Brown bottle." She found it. She climbed down from the chair, and as she did, the box of cartridges tipped and fell, and 20 or 30 rounds spilled out across the floor in a bright brass scatter. She froze. Elias set down the bucket he'd been carrying. He walked over and crouched down and started picking them up. After a second, she crouched down too. "I'm sorry," she said. "It's fine. I should have been more careful." "Marisol." He looked up at her. "It's fine. They're just cartridges. They didn't break." She was holding 3 of them in her palm, and she was looking at them with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not fear, exactly. Not worry. Something else. "Do you hunt a lot?" she said quietly. "When I need to." "Do you need to often?" He thought about how to answer that. "Often enough." She nodded. She handed him the 3 rounds. Their fingers brushed. Hers were cold. "I don't mind it," she said. "The hunting. Or the gun. I just wanted you to know I'm not afraid of it." "All right." "My father had a rifle. 2, actually. I grew up around them." "All right?" She looked at him. "I'm telling you so you don't think I'm going to be afraid every time you pick it up." "I didn't think that." "Some women are." "I know." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Were any of the others?" He didn't pretend not to understand. "2 of them," he said. "One of them asked me to keep it outside. The other one asked me to keep it unloaded." "Did you?" "I kept it unloaded. I didn't keep it outside." That was the right call. He almost smiled. "I thought so." They finished picking up the cartridges in silence. When the box was full again, he put it back on the shelf, farther from the edge this time, and she took the vinegar and went to the windows, and that was the end of it. But that night, lying on the floor by the stove, he thought about the way her hand had felt when their fingers brushed, cold and smaller than his, and steadier than he'd expected. And he thought about the fact that she'd told him she wasn't afraid. Not that she wouldn't be afraid. That she wasn't. As if it were a decision she'd already made. The first real test came on the 8th day. He woke that morning to a sound he knew in his bones before his mind caught up to it. Wind. Not the usual wind, the kind that moved through the clearing and rattled the shutters and went on its way. This was the other kind. The kind that came down off the peak like something with teeth. He got up. The stove had burned low. He fed it and then went to the window and looked out, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. The sky was the color of old iron. The pines across the clearing were bent almost double, their tops whipping back and forth like reeds in a current. Snow was coming down sideways, not falling, but driving, and the drifts against the north side of the cabin were already halfway up the wall. Marisol came out from behind the curtain. She was dressed, which meant she'd been awake, and she came and stood next to him at the window without saying anything. They watched the storm together. After a long time, she said, "How bad?" "Bad? How long?" "A day, maybe 2. She nodded. She didn't look afraid. She looked like somebody doing math in her head. "What do we need to do?" she said. "I need to bring the goats into the shed, and I need to get more wood into the lean-to before it drifts shut." "What do you need me to do?" He looked at her. "Stay inside. Keep the stove fed. If the wind gets under the roof, you'll hear it. If you hear it, come get me." "Where will you be?" "The shed first, then the lean-to, then back." "How long will that take?" "An hour, maybe more." She was quiet. Then she said, "If you're not back in 2 hours, I'm coming to look for you." "Marisol, I'm not arguing about it. I'm telling you." He looked at her face. It was the same face she'd worn when she'd told him she could fix the chicken coop, and when she'd told him the pots were dirty, and when she'd told him she wasn't afraid of the rifle. It was not a face that expected to be told no. "All right," he said. 2 hours. She nodded. "Go." It was worse outside than it had looked from the window. The wind hit him the second he stepped off the porch, a solid freezing wall of it that nearly took him off his feet. He bent into it and made for the shed, one arm up to shield his face, the other reaching out ahead of him because he couldn't see more than 5 feet through the snow. The goats were in a panic. They were crammed into the corner of their pen, the three of them huddled together with their heads down and their eyes rolling. He got the gate open and herded them toward the shed, slipping twice in the snow, and by the time he got them inside and the door latched, his hands were numb inside his gloves, and his face felt like it had been scraped with a file. He stood in the shed for a second, breathing hard, and then he turned around and went back out into it. The lean-to was on the east side of the cabin, and the wind was coming from the northwest, which meant it wasn't drifted shut yet. But it would be soon. He made 4 trips, carrying as much split wood as he could manage each time, stacking it inside the cabin door where it would stay dry. On the 4th trip, his boot went through a hidden drift, and he went down hard on one knee, and the wood scattered, and he had to spend 5 minutes in the blowing snow picking it all up again with hands that had stopped feeling like hands and started feeling like clubs. By the time he got back to the cabin, he'd lost track of how long he'd been outside. It could have been an hour. It could have been 3. He pushed the door open and stumbled in, and Marisol was there. She took one look at him and said, "Sit down." "I'm fine." "Sit down, Elias." He sat. She pulled off his gloves. His hands were white, the fingers stiff and clumsy. She didn't say anything about it. She just went to the stove and dipped a cloth in the pot of warm water she'd kept there, and she came back and wrapped his hands in it, and the feeling that came back into them was so painful he had to close his eyes and breathe through his teeth. She knelt in front of him and held the cloth there, not saying anything, just waiting. After a while the pain dulled to an ache, and then the ache dulled to a tingle, and then his hands were just his hands again. "Better?" she said. "Yeah," she let go. She stood up. "Are we done? Outside?" "For now." "Is there anything that's going to break if we don't get to it?" He thought about it. "No." "Then we stay inside until it passes." "That could be 2 days." "I know." She went to the sideboard and started pulling out food. Potatoes, a sack of cornmeal, a jar of preserved venison, a tin of lard. She set it all on the table. "We have enough?" she said. "We have enough." "Then we wait." They waited. The storm hammered the cabin for the rest of that day and all through the night and into the next morning. The wind came in gusts that made the whole structure shudder, and twice Elias heard a crack from the roof loud enough that he got up to check it. But both times it was just the beams settling, not breaking. Marisol kept the stove fed. She kept water boiling. She cooked potatoes and cornbread and a stew from the preserved venison that was better than anything Elias had made in the last 5 years. And when he said so, she just nodded and said, "I worked in a restaurant kitchen for 3 years. You learn or you get fired." They ate. They sat. The cabin was too small to do much else. On the second day, when the wind had died down enough that Elias could hear himself think, he went to the shelf and pulled down the wooden box where he kept his father's old deck of cards. He brought it to the table. "You play?" he said. Marisol looked up from the sock she'd been darning. One of his socks, he realized, which she'd pulled from the basket under the bed without asking, and which she was mending with small, tight stitches that would hold. "Play what?" she said. "Rummy, poker, anything." "I know rummy. You want to?" She set the sock down. "All right." They played. She beat him 4 hands out of 7, and on the 5th hand she caught him trying to bluff with a pair of 3s, and she'd looked at him over the top of her cards and said, "You're a terrible liar, Elias." And he'd laughed, actually laughed, and the sound of it had startled them both. On the evening of the second day, the wind finally stopped. The silence that came after it was so sudden and so complete that Elias got up and went to the window just to make sure the world was still there. It was. The sky was clearing from the west, a long line of pale blue opening up over the ridge, and the snow had stopped, and the clearing was buried under drifts that came up past the porch rail. "It's over," he said. Marisol came and stood beside him. She looked out at the white expanse, at the pines bent and heavy, at the shed half buried and the lean-to drifted in. "How long to dig out?" she said. "A day, maybe 2. Then we should start tomorrow." He looked at her. "We? I can shovel." "I'm not asking you to." "I know." She turned away from the window. "But I'm going to." But they dug out together. It took a day and a half. Elias started at the porch and worked his way to the shed, and Marisol started at the lean-to and worked her way to the woodpile. And they moved through the snow with their heads down and their breaths steaming. And they didn't talk much because there wasn't much to say. The work said it. By the end of the first day, Elias's back was screaming and his shoulders felt like they'd been beaten with a hammer. And when he came inside and sat down at the table, he couldn't hide the way his hands were shaking. Marisol didn't say anything. She just heated water and brought him a cup of it with a little whiskey stirred in, and she set it in front of him and went back to the stove. He drank it. The warmth spread through his chest. "Thank you," he said. She didn't turn around. "You're welcome." On the second day they finished. The paths were clear, the stock were fed, the firewood was stacked inside, and the damage, a broken shutter, a torn section of the shed roof, was noted and would be fixed when there was time. That night they sat at the table after supper, too tired to do much else, and Marisol said, "Does it always come like that? Once or twice a winter? And you've always handled it alone?" "Yes." She was quiet. Then she said, "You don't have to anymore." He looked up. She was looking back at him, and her face was tired and wind-burned, and there was a smudge of soot on her jaw. And she looked, he thought, like somebody who had earned the right to say that. "I know," he said. "Do you?" "I'm starting to." She nodded. She didn't smile, but something in her face softened, just a little, and she reached across the table and put her hand on top of his, just for a second, and then she stood up and went to wash the dishes. Elias sat there with his hand on the table where hers had been, and he thought about the fact that she had stayed. Not just through the storm, through the digging out, through the work, through the cold and the wind and the fear that the roof might come off, or the shed might collapse, or the stock might die. And she had not once said, "This is too much," or "I didn't sign up for this," or "Take me back down." She had stayed. And for the first time since she'd arrived, he let himself think the thing he'd been trying not to think. He thought, maybe this one is different. The days after the storm were strange. Not bad strange, just strange. The work continued. The wood had to be split. The traps had to be checked. The chimney had to be cleaned. But now when Elias went out in the morning, he came back to a cabin that smelled like bread, or stew, or the lye soap Marisol used to scrub the floor. And when he came in with snow on his boots and his face numb from the cold, there was coffee waiting, and a fire in the stove, and a woman who looked up from whatever she was doing and said, "You're back," as if it mattered that he was. He didn't know what to do with that. He'd lived alone for so long that he'd forgotten what it was like to be noticed, to have somebody mark his coming and going, to have somebody ask if he was hungry or cold, or if his hands hurt from the work. Marisol didn't fuss. She didn't hover. But she noticed, and he noticed her noticing. One afternoon, he came in from the shed and found her standing at the window, looking out at the ridge with her arms folded and her face very still. He almost didn't say anything. Then he did. "You all right?" he said. She didn't turn around. "I'm fine." "You sure?" "I'm fine, Elias." He hung up his coat. He washed his hands. He was about to go check the stove when she said quietly, "Do you ever get tired of it?" He stopped. "Tired of what?" "The work, the mountain, being up here." He thought about it. "Sometimes." "What do you do when you're tired?" "I keep working." She turned her head then. She looked at him. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I left Pueblo because I was tired. I worked in a boarding house for 6 years, and I got tired of the same rooms and the same people and the same meals, and I thought if I stayed there one more year, I was going to disappear into it and never come back out." She paused. "I thought coming here would be different, and it is, but it's also just another kind of tired, isn't it?" He didn't know what to say to that, so he said the truth. "Yeah," he said. "It is. Does it get easier?" "No." "Does it get better?" He looked at her. She was still standing at the window, backlit by the thin winter sun, and her face was in shadow, but he could see her eyes, and they were watching him, and they were not looking for comfort. They were looking for truth. "I don't know," he said. "I've never had anybody here long enough to find out." She nodded slowly. "All right. Is that why you're asking? Because you're thinking about leaving?" "No." "You sure?" "I'm sure." She turned away from the window. "I'm asking because I want to know what I'm staying for." And there it was. The question he'd been waiting for since the day she'd arrived. The question all 7 of the others had asked in one way or another, and the question he'd never had a good answer to. He still didn't. "I can't tell you that," he said. I can tell you what I'm staying for. I'm staying because this is what I built, and I don't know how to do anything else. But what you're staying for, that's yours, not mine." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Fair enough." She went back to whatever she'd been doing before. Folding laundry, he thought, or mending something. And Elias stood there in the middle of the cabin and felt like he'd just barely passed a test he hadn't known he was taking. 3 weeks after Marisol arrived, Elias came back from checking the trap line and found her sitting at the table with a piece of paper in front of her and a pencil in her hand. "What's that?" he said. She looked up. "A list." "Of what?" "Things we need." He hung up his coat. "We have everything we need. We have everything we need to survive. We don't have everything we need to live." She tapped the paper. "We're out of sugar. We're low on salt. The flour's going to run out in another month. And we don't have any vegetables." "I have potatoes." "Potatoes are not vegetables." "They're not? They're potatoes." She set the pencil down. "When's the next supply run?" "Spring." "Spring. That's when Caldwell's man comes through." She looked at him like he'd just told her the moon was made of cheese. "You go 4 months without resupply?" "I stock up in the fall." "And you didn't think to stock up on sugar?" "I don't use sugar." "Well, I do." She stood up. "And I'm not spending the next 3 months eating nothing but potatoes and venison and cornbread." "What do you want me to do about it?" "I want you to take me down to Hollow Creek so I can buy supplies." He stared at her. "Now?" "No, next year." "Yes, now." "Marisol, it's the middle of winter." "I know what season it is. The trail's bad. The trail's always bad." "It's a full day down and a full day back. Then we should leave early." He opened his mouth. He closed it. He didn't know what to say to a woman who'd just told him she wanted to spend 2 days on a freezing mountain trail so she could buy sugar. "You're serious," he said. "Completely." "We could wait until spring." "We could. But I don't want to." She picked up the list. "I spent 6 years cooking in a boarding house where I didn't get to decide what we made or when we made it. I'm not doing that here. If I'm going to stay on this mountain, I'm going to do it on my terms. And my terms include vegetables." He looked at her. She looked back. "All right," he said. "We'll go down tomorrow." They left at first light. The trip down was cold and slow and silent. The same as the trip up had been 3 weeks earlier, but different too. This time Marisol wasn't watching the country to see if she could survive it. She was watching it like she already knew she could. They reached Hollow Creek just after noon. Elias tied Job at the rail outside Caldwell's general store, and they went in together, and the warmth hit them like a wall. The store was crowded. It always was this time of year. Everyone who'd been snowed in for the last month coming down for one last resupply before the real cold set in. Elias nodded to a couple of men he knew slightly, and they nodded back, and their eyes went to Marisol, and he saw the question forming before they asked it. "This your wife, Turner?" He hesitated. Marisol didn't. "I am," she said. She said it the way she said everything else, flat, sure, as if she'd decided it, and that was the end of it. The man grinned. "Well, congratulations. Didn't know you had it in you." Elias didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded, and Marisol took his arm, she'd never done that before, and steered him toward the back of the store where the dry goods were kept. "You didn't have to say that," he said quietly when they were out of earshot. "Say what?" "That you're my wife." "Why not?" "Because you're not. Not yet." She looked up at him. "Do you want me to be?" The question hit him like a fist. He stopped walking. He didn't know what to say. "I don't know." "That's fine." She let go of his arm. "But if we're going to live together and work together and share a house, people are going to assume, and I'd rather control what they assume than let them make up their own stories." She paused. "Unless you'd prefer I tell them I'm your housekeeper." "No." "Then I'm your wife." She turned and walked toward the counter, and Elias stood there in the middle of Caldwell's general store and thought about the fact that Marisol Vega had just decided, without asking him, that she was his wife. And the strangest part was that he didn't mind. He minded that he didn't mind. But he didn't mind. They bought sugar and salt and a sack of dried beans and another of cornmeal. They bought 4 tins of lard and a block of soap and a small bag of dried apples that Marisol held up and looked at like it was treasure. They bought lamp oil and cartridges and a length of rope to replace the one that had frayed through on the shed door. The total came to more than Elias had planned to spend. But when he reached for his billfold, Marisol put her hand on his arm. "I'll pay half," she said. "You don't have to." "Elias." "All right." She pulled a small leather purse from inside her coat and counted out bills onto the counter, and Caldwell, a big man with a gray beard and eyes that missed nothing, watched her do it and then looked at Elias with something that might have been approval. "You got yourself a good one this time, Turner," Caldwell said. Elias looked at Marisol. She was repacking the dried apples into her satchel with the same careful attention she gave everything. "Yeah," he said. "I think I did." They loaded the supplies into the sleigh and started back up the mountain. The sun was already dropping toward the ridge, and the cold was settling in, and Elias knew they weren't going to make it all the way back before dark. "We'll have to stop halfway," he said. "There's a lean-to at the switchback. We can shelter there." "All right. It's not much." "I didn't expect much." They reached the lean-to just as the last light bled out of the sky. It was 3 walls and a roof, built by somebody years ago as a waypoint for travelers, and it smelled like old smoke and damp wood. Elias unhitched Job and led him under the overhang, and Marisol started gathering up dead pine branches for a fire. By the time he had the horse settled, she had a fire going in the stone ring somebody had built in the center of the lean-to. She'd laid out the buffalo robe and the blankets, and she was sitting on one end of the robe with her hands held out to the flames. Elias sat down across from her. The fire crackled and popped. "You warm enough?" he said. "I'm fine." "You sure?" She looked at him. "If I wasn't fine, I'd tell you." "All right." They sat in silence for a while. The fire burned. The wind moved through the pines. Then Marisol said, "Why did you keep writing to Mrs. Halverson after the first few didn't work out?" He thought about it. "Because I didn't know what else to do." "You could have stayed alone." "I could have." "But you didn't want to." "No." "Why not?" He looked at the fire. "Because being alone is easy. It's staying human that's hard." She was quiet. Then she said, "Is that what you think I'm here for? To keep you human?" "No." "Then what?" He didn't know how to answer that. He'd been asking himself the same question for 3 weeks, and he still didn't have an answer that felt true. "I don't know," he said finally. "I think I'm still figuring that out." She nodded. "Fair enough." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "For what it's worth, I'm still figuring it out too." "What brought you up here? Really?" "I told you I was tired." "That's not a reason. That's just what you were running from." She looked at him across the fire, and her face was half in shadow and half in light, and he couldn't read it. "You want the truth?" she said. "Yeah. I came up here because I wanted to see if I could. I wanted to see if I was strong enough to do something hard and not quit. And I wanted to see if there was a man out there who wouldn't expect me to be anything other than what I am." She paused. "So far, you haven't disappointed me." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. They sat there until the fire burned low, and then they lay down side by side under the buffalo robe, not touching, with the darkness pressing in around them and the cold creeping up from the ground. Just before he fell asleep, he heard her voice, quiet, almost too quiet to hear. "Elias?" "Yeah?" "I'm glad I came." He turned his head. He could just barely see her face in the faint glow of the embers. "So am I," he said. And he meant it. They made it back to the cabin by mid-morning the next day, cold and stiff but intact. Elias unloaded the supplies while Marisol got the stove going, and by the time he came back inside with the last sack of cornmeal, she already had coffee brewing and was unpacking the dried apples like they were something precious. "I'm going to make a pie," she said. "With what?" "Apples, flour, lard, sugar, that's all you need." "I don't have a pie pan." She looked at him. "Then I'll make it in the skillet." "You can do that?" "You can do anything in a skillet if you're not precious about it." He set the cornmeal on the sideboard and watched her work. She moved around the cabin now like she'd been there for years instead of weeks, reaching for things without looking, stepping around the creaky floorboard without thinking about it. She'd learned the space. She'd made it hers. He realized he didn't mind that either. That night they ate the pie, burnt a little on the bottom, sweet enough to make his teeth ache, better than anything he'd tasted in 10 years. And afterward, Marisol sat back in her chair and said, "I want to plant a garden in the spring." Elias looked up from his plate. "A garden? Vegetables, maybe some herbs. There's a flat spot on the south side of the cabin that gets good sun. The ground up here's not great. I know. I'll need to build it up, compost, maybe some manure from the goats." She was looking at him with that same steady attention she always had, the look that said she'd already thought this through and was just waiting to see if he was going to argue. "But it can be done." "Yeah," he said, "it can." "So I can do it?" "You don't need to ask me." "I'm asking anyway." He set his fork down. "Then yes, you can do it." She nodded. "Good." She stood up and started clearing the plates, and Elias sat there and thought about the fact that Marisol was making plans for the spring. Not plans to leave, plans to stay. He thought about that a lot over the next few days. Tema. January came in hard. The temperature dropped and kept dropping until the cold wasn't just something you felt, it was something you lived inside of, something that pressed against the walls and seeped through the cracks and turned your breath to ice before it left your mouth. Elias woke every morning to frost on the inside of the windows and water frozen solid in the basin, and every morning he fed the stove and broke the ice and went out into the cold to do the work that never stopped. And every morning Marisol was up before him, already dressed, already moving. They fell into a rhythm that was deeper than the one they'd had before. He chopped wood, she stacked it. He brought in snow to melt for water, she boiled it and rationed it and used it 3 times before she threw it out. He checked the traps, she skinned and cleaned whatever he brought back. They worked together without talking about it, without planning it, just moving around each other in the small space like 2 parts of the same machine. But there were moments, small moments, easy to miss, when the rhythm broke. One afternoon, Elias came in from the shed and found her standing at the stove with her back to him, her shoulders tight, her hands gripping the edge of the cast iron like she was trying to keep herself upright. "Marisol?" She didn't turn around. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." "I said I'm fine." He stood there for a second, not sure what to do. Then he walked over and stood next to her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and he didn't say anything, just waited. After a long time, she said very quietly, "Do you ever wonder if you made a mistake?" "About what?" "Coming up here, building this, staying." He thought about it. "Every winter. And I haven't left yet." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "That's not very reassuring." "It's the truth." She was quiet. Then she said, "I don't regret coming here. I want you to know that. But some days it's hard. Some days I wake up and the cabin feels like it's getting smaller, and the mountain feels like it's getting bigger, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep doing this." "You are." "You don't know that." "Yeah, I do." He turned to look at her. "You stayed through the storm. You dug out with me. You went down the mountain in the middle of winter for dried apples. You're strong enough." She turned her head and looked at him, and her eyes were wet, though she wasn't crying, and she said, "What if I'm not?" "Then we'll figure it out." "We?" "Yeah." She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached out and took his hand, and her fingers were cold, but they were steady, and she held on. "Okay," she said. "Okay." They stood there by the stove, not talking, just holding hands, and outside the wind howled and the cold pressed in, and the mountain did what the mountain always did, which was nothing, which was everything, which was exactly what it had been doing for 1,000 years before they got there, and would keep doing for 1,000 years after they were gone. The next morning, she was better. Not all the way better, but better. She got up, she made coffee, she moved through the cabin with the same steady purpose she always had. And Elias didn't mention the night before, and neither did she. But something had changed. He couldn't name it exactly. It was in the way she looked at him now, like she was seeing something she hadn't seen before. It was in the way she stayed a little closer when they worked together, in the way she laughed a little more easily when he said something that wasn't quite a joke but wasn't quite serious either. It was in the way she said his name, not Mr. Turner, not even Elias the way she'd said it at first, careful and measured, but Elias the way you say the name of somebody you know, somebody you've decided to keep knowing, He felt it too. The shift. The opening. One evening they were sitting at the table after supper playing cards by lamplight, and she beat him 3 hands in a row and then looked up and said, "You're letting me win." "I'm not." "You are." "Marisol, I'm a lot of things, but I'm not a good enough actor to fake being this bad at rummy." She laughed. It was the first real laugh he'd heard from her, not the short, quiet ones she usually gave, but a full one, the kind that made her tip her head back and close her eyes, and the sound of it did something to him that he wasn't ready for. When she opened her eyes again, he was looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing. Elias." "I like hearing you laugh," he said. "That's all." She went still. Then she said softly, "I like laughing." "Then you should do it more. You should give me more reasons to." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just dealt the next hand and they kept playing, but the air in the cabin had changed again, and this time he knew what it was. It was want. Not the sharp, desperate kind. The slow kind. The kind that built up over weeks of working side by side and eating across from each other and lying 10 feet apart in the dark. The kind that didn't ask for anything but made itself known anyway. He didn't do anything about it. He didn't know if he should. He didn't know if she wanted him to, but he felt it, and he was pretty sure she felt it too. 2 weeks later, on a morning so cold that the air itself seemed to crack, Marisol woke him by shaking his shoulder. "Elias." He sat up fast, already reaching for his boots. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, but I need you to come outside." "Why?" "Just come." She was already dressed, already wearing her coat, and there was something in her face, not fear, not worry, but something bright and urgent, that made him get up without asking any more questions. He pulled on his clothes and followed her out onto the porch. The sun was just coming up over the ridge, and the whole clearing was flooded with light so bright and so clean it hurt to look at. The snow was fresh from the night before, untouched except for the line of Marisol's footprints leading from the porch to the middle of the clearing and back again. "Look," she said, and she pointed. He looked. At first he didn't see it. Then he did. Tracks. Dozens of them. Maybe hundreds. Crossing the clearing in long, loping strides, coming down from the ridge and heading east toward the creek. Wolf tracks. "They came through last night," Marisol said. "I heard them. I got up to look, and they were right there, maybe 20 feet from the cabin. A whole pack." Elias stared at the tracks. His heart was beating faster than it should have been. "You should have woken me up." "Why?" "Because there were wolves 20 feet from the cabin." "I know, I saw them." She turned to him. "Elias, they were beautiful." He looked at her. She was smiling, not a small smile, but a real one. And her eyes were bright, and she looked like somebody who'd just seen something she'd never expected to see and couldn't quite believe it had happened. "You weren't afraid," he said. "I was terrified." She laughed. "But I wanted to see them more than I wanted to be safe. So I watched. And they didn't even look at the cabin. They just kept going, like we weren't even here." He didn't know what to say. He looked back at the tracks, at the long line of them disappearing into the trees, and he thought about Marisol standing at the window in the dark, alone, watching wolves pass by, and not waking him, and not running, and not doing anything except standing there and looking. "You're not like the others," he said. She turned to him. "What?" "The other women, the ones who came before you. You're not like them." "I know." "No, I mean—" He stopped. He didn't know how to say what he meant. "They were afraid of this place, of the mountain, of me, of everything, and you're not. You're afraid sometimes, but you're not. You don't let it stop you." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Do you know why I'm not afraid of you?" "No, because you're afraid too. You're just better at hiding it." He felt something crack open in his chest. "I'm not afraid." "Yes, you are. You're afraid I'm going to leave. You've been afraid of it since the day I got here. Maybe before that. And you're so busy being afraid that you haven't noticed that I'm not going anywhere." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." "Marisol." "I'm not leaving, Elias." She said it the way she said everything, flat and sure, like it was already decided. "I'm staying. Not because I have to, not because I don't have anywhere else to go, but because I want to. And if you can't believe that, then you need to figure out why, because it's not about me. It's about you. He stared at her. The sun was rising higher now, turning the snow from blue to white to gold, and Marisol was standing there in her patched coat with her breath steaming in the cold, and she was looking at him like she could see straight through him, and maybe she could. I don't know how to do this, he said quietly. Do what? This. Trust somebody. Let somebody stay. Then learn. What if I can't? Then we'll figure it out. She stepped closer. But you have to try, Elias, because I can't do this by myself. I can stay here, I can work, I can build a garden and cook your meals and fix your hinges, but I can't make you believe I'm not going to leave. You have to decide that on your own. He looked at her. She looked back. Are we just surviving here, she said, or are we building something real? Yet, the question hung in the air between them, and Elias knew it was the question he'd been avoiding since the day she'd arrived. Maybe since the day he'd written to Mrs. Halverson the first time. Maybe since the day his father had walked out into the snow and never come back. He'd spent 18 years surviving. He'd built a cabin and run a trapline and kept himself fed and warm and alive. And he'd done it alone because alone was easier. Alone was safer. Alone meant nobody could leave him because there was nobody there to leave. But Marisol was asking him for something different. She was asking him to stop surviving and start living. She was asking him to trust her. She was asking him to build something that might break, that might fail, that might end with him standing on the porch watching another woman disappear down the mountain. She was asking him to risk it anyway. He took a breath. I want to build something real, he said. Then say it like you mean it. I do mean it. Then stop treating me like I'm going to run the first time things get hard. Stop sleeping on the floor. Stop acting like you're doing me a favor by letting me stay. And stop looking at me like you're waiting for me to change my mind. I don't. You do. Every time I say I'm staying, you look at me like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop, like you're counting the days until I figure out this was a mistake. She stepped closer. She was close enough now that he could see the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the small scar on her jaw, the way her breath made small clouds in the cold air. I'm not the others, Elias. I didn't come here looking for an easy life. I came here looking for a real one. And if you want that too, then you need to stop waiting for me to leave and start believing I'm going to stay. He didn't know when he'd started reaching for her. He just knew that his hand was on her arm, and then on her shoulder, and then on the side of her face, and she was looking up at him with those dark, steady eyes, and he was looking back, and there was nothing between them now except the cold air and the choice. I believe you, he said. Do you? I'm trying to. That's good enough. She put her hand over his. For now. He kissed her. He didn't plan it. He didn't think about it. He just leaned down and kissed her, and she kissed him back. And her lips were cold and her hand was cold, but her mouth was warm, and for a second the whole world was just that. Her mouth, her hand, the bright cold morning, the mountains all around them watching and not caring and being exactly what they'd always been. When they pulled apart, she was smiling. Took you long enough, she said. He laughed. He actually laughed. I didn't know if you wanted me to. Elias, I've been washing your socks for 6 weeks. What did you think that meant? I thought it meant you were being practical. It is practical. It's also an answer. He kissed her again. This time she put her arms around his neck, and he put his arms around her waist, and they stood there on the porch in the freezing cold, kissing like two people who'd just figured out they were allowed to. And when they finally stopped, it was only because Marisol pulled back and said, breathlessly, we should go inside before we freeze to death. Good idea. They went inside. Elias fed the stove. Marisol made coffee. They sat at the table across from each other the way they did every morning, but this time when their knees bumped under the table, neither of them moved away. So what happens now? Marisol said. I don't know. That's not very reassuring. I'm making this up as I go. She smiled. Good. So am I. Things changed after that. Not all at once, but in small incremental ways that added up to something bigger. Elias stopped sleeping on the floor. The first night he moved into the bedroom, he lay there in the dark on his side of the bed with Marisol on the other side. And there was a foot of space between them, and neither of them crossed it. But the second night the space was smaller, and the third night it was smaller still, and by the end of the week they were sleeping curled together like two people who'd been doing it for years. He stopped treating her like a guest. He stopped asking if she was warm enough, if she had enough to eat, if she needed anything. He started asking her what she thought about the fence post that was leaning, about whether they should slaughter one of the goats before spring, about whether the shed roof could make it through another winter or if it needed to be replaced now. He started asking her opinion, and she started giving it, and sometimes they agreed and sometimes they didn't. And when they didn't, they argued about it like two people who knew the argument wasn't going to end with one of them walking away. And he started to believe, really believe, not just hope, that she was staying. It wasn't one moment. It was 100 small moments. It was the way she talked about the garden she was going to plant in the spring, not if she planted it, but when. It was the way she started rearranging things in the cabin without asking, moving the skillet to a hook closer to the stove, shifting the woodpile to the other side of the door, hanging a piece of cloth over the window to keep the draft out. It was the way she looked at him sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking back, with an expression that wasn't hope or fear or calculation, but something simpler and harder to fake. It was the way she touched him now, not tentatively, not like she was asking permission, but like it was her right. A hand on his shoulder when she passed behind him. Her knee pressed against his under the table. Her fingers tangled in his hair when they kissed. She was settling in, not just to the cabin, but to him, and he was settling into her. One night in early February, they were lying in bed, not sleeping, just lying there in the dark. And Marisol said, "Tell me about the first one." "The first what?" "The first woman, Gerda." He didn't want to talk about it. Then he realized that not wanting to talk about it was exactly the kind of thing he used to do before, when he was still afraid. "She was from Wisconsin," he said, "or maybe Michigan, somewhere cold. Mrs. Halverson said she'd be used to winters." "Was she?" "No, or maybe she was used to winters, just not to being alone in them." He stared up at the ceiling. "She cried a lot. I didn't know what to do with that. I'd ask her what was wrong, and she'd just shake her head and keep crying. After 2 weeks, she told me she wanted to go home, so I took her." "Did you try to stop her?" "No." "Why not?" "Because she didn't want to be here." "What was I supposed to do, force her to stay?" Marisol was quiet for a second. Then she said, "You could have asked her why she was crying." "I did." "No, I mean really asked. Not just what's wrong, but what do you need? There's a difference." He thought about that. "I didn't know there was. Most men don't." She rolled onto her side to face him. "I'm not saying it would have changed anything. Maybe she would have left anyway, but maybe she was crying because she was scared, and if you'd asked her what she was scared of, you could have done something about it." "Like what?" "I don't know. Talked to her, sat with her, made her feel like she wasn't alone." She reached out and put her hand on his chest. "You're good at a lot of things, Elias, but you're not good at asking for help. And you're not good at seeing when other people need it. And you are?" "I'm better at it than you." He almost argued. Then he didn't, because she was right. "I'm trying to be better," he said. "I know. That's why I'm still here." They lay there in the dark, her hand on his chest, his hand covering hers. And after a while she said, "Do you want to know why I really came up here?" "You told me you were tired." "That's part of it, but it's not all of it." She was quiet for a second. "I was married before." He went still. "You were?" "For 3 years. His name was Daniel. He was a ranch hand on my father's property. We got married when I was 23, and for the first year it was good. Then he started drinking, and then he started hitting me. And then one night he came home drunk, and I had had enough, so I hit him back, with a skillet." She said it matter-of-factly, like she was talking about the weather. "I broke his nose. He left. I filed for divorce. It took a year to go through, and by the time it did, I'd already moved to Pueblo and started over. Miss Babu Shapohain." Elias didn't know what to say. He wanted to ask if Daniel was still alive and where he was, and whether Elias needed to worry about him showing up. But what he said was, "I'm sorry. Don't be." "I'm not." She shifted closer. "I'm telling you because I want you to understand something. I didn't come up here because I'm desperate. I didn't come here because I had nowhere else to go. I came here because I wanted to see if there was a man out there who wouldn't try to break me. And you haven't. You've let me be exactly who I am, and that's why I'm staying. He turned his head to look at her. She was close enough that he could see her face in the faint starlight coming through the window. "You think I wouldn't try to break you?" he said. "I know you wouldn't, because you're too afraid I'd leave if you did." He smiled. "That's probably true." "It's definitely true." She kissed him. "But that's all right. I'll take it." The winter wore on. February turned into March. The days got longer, the light got stronger, and the cold started to lose its edge. Not much. Not enough that you'd notice unless you were paying attention. But Elias was paying attention now. He was paying attention to a lot of things. He noticed the way Marisol had started humming while she worked. Small, tuneless things under her breath that she probably didn't know she was doing. He noticed the way she stood at the window in the mornings, looking out at the clearing, and the way her face had changed, less guarded, less careful, more open. He noticed the way she touched him now, casually, without thinking about it, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And he noticed the way she'd started talking about the future. Not in vague terms, not if we do this, or maybe we could, but in concrete ones. When I plant the garden, when the snow melts, when we expand the cabin. She was planning, she was building, she was staying. One evening in late March, he came in from checking the trap line and found her sitting at the table with a piece of paper in front of her and a pencil in her hand, the same way he'd found her that day she'd made the supply list. "What's that?" he said. She looked up. "A letter." "To who?" "Mrs. Halverson." He felt something cold slide down his spine. "Why?" "Because she wrote to you 3 weeks ago. The letter came with Caldwell's man and you left it on the sideboard and never opened it." She held up an envelope. He recognized the cream-colored paper, the brown ink, the tidy handwriting. "I opened it. I hope that's all right." "What does it say?" "She wants to know if I'm still here, and if I'm not, she has another candidate for you." The cold feeling spread. "What did you tell her?" Marisol set the pencil down. "I told her I'm still here. I told her you're not looking for anyone else. And I told her to take you off her list." She looked at him. "Is that all right?" He crossed the room. He sat down across from her. He took her hand. "Yeah," he said. "That's all right." She smiled. "Good, because I already sealed it." He laughed. "You didn't wait for me to say yes." "I didn't need to. I already knew what the answer was." "Did you?" "Elias." She squeezed his hand. "You kissed me on the porch in the middle of winter and asked me to stay. I know what the answer is." He looked at her, at this woman who'd shown up in Hollow Creek with a carpet bag and a letter and no illusions, who'd stayed through the storm and the cold and the silence, who'd argued with him and worked beside him and kissed him like she meant it, who'd decided on her own that she was his wife, and then made it true. And he felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for 18 years. "I love you," he said. She went still. "What?" "I love you. I don't know when it started. Maybe the first day. Maybe yesterday. I don't know. But I do." She stared at him. Then she started crying. Not the sad kind. The other kind. The kind that came with smiling. "You're an idiot," she said. "What?" "I've been waiting for you to say that for 2 months." "I didn't know I was supposed to." "You weren't supposed to. You were supposed to figure it out on your own, which you did, which makes you slightly less of an idiot." She got up, came around the table, and sat in his lap. "I love you too." "Yeah?" "Of course I do. Why do you think I'm still here?" He kissed her. She kissed him back. And for the first time since he'd built the cabin, since he'd started writing the letters, since the day his father had walked out into the snow, Elias Turner felt like he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. Spring came late that year, the way it always did in the mountains. The snow didn't melt so much as it retreated, pulling back in inches, leaving the ground muddy and raw. By mid-April, the clearing was half brown dirt and half gray slush, and the creek was running high and fast with runoff, and the air had that particular smell it only got in spring. Wet earth and pine sap, and something green trying to break through. Marisol started her garden the first week the ground was workable. Elias came back from repairing the fence line one afternoon and found her on her knees in the dirt on the south side of the cabin, digging. She'd marked out a rectangle maybe 10 feet by 15, and she'd already turned over half of it, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows, and her hair tied back with a piece of string. "You need help," he said. She didn't look up. "No." "You sure?" "I'm sure. He stood there for a second, watching her work. Then he went inside, changed into an old shirt, and came back out with the second shovel. She looked up when she heard him. "I said I didn't need help." "I know." He drove the shovel into the dirt. "But I'm helping anyway." She looked like she was going to argue. Then she didn't. She just smiled a little and went back to digging, and they worked side by side in silence until the whole plot was turned and ready. That night, sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, Marisol said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For helping, even though I said I didn't need it." "You didn't need it, but it went faster with two." "That's not why you did it." He looked at her. "No, it's not." "Why did you?" He thought about it. "Because I wanted to, because it's your garden, but it's our cabin, and I like the idea of us building something together." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "You're getting better at this." "At what?" "At being married." "We're not married." "Might as well be." She set her cup down. "You know people in town think we are." "I know." "Does that bother you?" "No." "Do you want to be? Actually married, I mean." The question caught him off guard. He set his own cup down. "Do you?" he said. "I asked you first." Marisol. Elias. She was looking at him with that same steady attention she always had, the look that said she already knew the answer and was just waiting for him to catch up. "It's not a trick question. Either you want to marry me or you don't." "I want to," he said, "but I don't know if you do. You were married before. It didn't go well." "That's true. But that was Daniel. This is you, and you're not him." "How do you know I won't turn into him?" "Because Daniel was a drunk and a coward, and you're neither of those things." She reached across the table and took his hand. "And because if you ever hit me, I'd do more than break your nose." He smiled. "That's reassuring." "It should be." She squeezed his hand. "I'm not afraid of you, Elias. I told you that already, and I'm not afraid of marrying you either. But I want to know if you're asking." "I am." "Then ask properly." He stared at her. "Right now?" "Why not?" "Because I don't have a ring." "I don't need a ring." "Because I didn't plan this." "Good. I don't want you to plan it. I want you to mean it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he got up from the table, came around to her side, and got down on one knee on the cabin floor that she'd scrubbed and he'd built, and they'd both walked across 1,000 times. "Marisol Vega," he said, "will you marry me?" She looked down at him, and her eyes were bright, and she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." He stood up and pulled her up with him and kissed her, and she laughed against his mouth, and it was the best sound he'd ever heard. "We should go to town," she said when they broke apart. "Make it official." "When?" "Next week. When Caldwell's man comes through, we can ride down with him." "All right." "And Elias?" "Yeah?" "I still don't need a ring." "I know. But I'm getting you one anyway." Pues. They went down to Hollow Creek the following Tuesday. It was a clear day, warmer than it had been in months, and the trail was passable for the first time since winter had set in. They rode down together in the wagon, and Marisol sat beside him on the bench with her hand resting on his knee, and they didn't talk much, just watched the country go by. When they reached the town, Elias drove straight to the church at the south end of the main road. It was a small white building with a crooked steeple, and the minister was a thin gray man named Pritchard, who Elias had met exactly twice before. Pritchard married them in his office with 2 witnesses pulled in from the street, a woman who worked at the general store, and a man Elias didn't know. The whole thing took maybe 15 minutes. Elias said the words. Marisol said the words. Pritchard pronounced them married, and that was it. Afterward, standing on the church steps in the spring sun, Marisol said, "That was quick? Did you want it to be longer?" "No, I just thought it would feel different." "Does it?" She thought about it. "No, it feels the same, which I guess makes sense since we've been acting married for 3 months already." "That's true." She took his hand. "But I'm glad we did it anyway." "Me too." They walked down the street to the general store. Caldwell was behind the counter, and when he saw them come in together, he grinned. "Well, well," he said. "If it isn't the Turners." Marisol smiled. It's official now. I figured it would be. You two looked settled last time you were in. He leaned on the counter. What brings you down today besides making honest people out of yourselves? Supplies, Elias said. And I need to see if you have a ring. Caldwell raised his eyebrows. A ring? A wedding ring. I told you I didn't need one, Marisol said. I know. I'm getting you one anyway. Caldwell laughed. Smart man. He reached under the counter and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside were maybe a dozen rings, plain bands in different sizes. These are what I've got. Nothing fancy, but they're solid. Marisol picked through them, and after a minute she pulled out a simple gold band and handed it to Elias. Try this one. He slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. How's that? He said. It's good. You sure? Elias, it's a ring. It fits. I like it. Stop asking me if I'm sure. Caldwell laughed again. You've got your hands full with this one, Turner. I know, Elias said, but he was smiling. They bought the ring and a few other things. More flour, more salt, a length of canvas Marisol wanted for the garden. And then they went to the cafe across the street and ate lunch. It was the first meal they'd had in a restaurant since Marisol had arrived, and the first meal Elias had eaten out in maybe 5 years, and it felt strange and good at the same time. On the way back up the mountain, Marisol said, We should do that more often. Do what? Come to town. See people. It's good to remember there's a world outside the mountain. You getting tired of the mountain already? No. But I don't want to disappear into it either. She looked at him. Do you? He thought about it. For the last 10 years, disappearing into the mountain was exactly what he'd been doing. It had been easier that way. Simpler. But now, with Marisol beside him and a ring on her finger and the future stretching out in front of them like an open trail, the idea of disappearing didn't seem as appealing as it once had. No, he said. I don't. Good. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Because I'm planning to drag you down there at least once a month from now on. I can live with that. I know you can. The garden grew. By the end of May, Marisol had rows of beans and peas and carrots coming up, and a patch of lettuce that was already big enough to harvest. She'd built a fence around the whole plot to keep the goats out, and she'd rigged up a system of ropes and buckets to carry water from the creek when it didn't rain. Elias helped when she asked, but mostly he left her to it. The garden was hers. She'd planned it, planted it, tended it. Watching her work in it, kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds, checking the leaves for bugs, he realized that it was the first thing she'd built on the mountain that was entirely her own, and it was thriving. One evening in early June, she came in from the garden with a basket of lettuce and radishes and set it on the table with a look of satisfaction that bordered on smug. Look at that, she said. Elias looked. That's good. That's better than good. That's from our garden. From dirt I turned and seeds I planted. That's ours. You did all the work. We did the work. You helped dig. You helped build the fence. You carried half the water. She sat down and started washing the radishes in a bowl. This is a partnership, Elias. I thought we established that. We did. Then stop acting like everything I do is separate from you. We're in this together now, for better or for worse. That's what the vows said. Then start believing it. He sat down across from her. I do believe it. Good. She handed him a radish. Eat this. He ate it. It was crisp and peppery and tasted like spring, and it was one of the best things he'd ever put in his mouth. That's good, he said. I know. She smiled. And there's going to be a lot more of it. They expanded the cabin in July. It wasn't a big expansion, just a room added onto the back, maybe 10 feet by 12, with a window facing east and a door that connected to the main room. Elias had been thinking about it for years, but had never had a reason to do it. Now he did. What's it for? Marisol asked when he told her his plan. Storage, or a second bedroom, or whatever you want. She looked at him. A second bedroom? Eventually, maybe. Elias. What? Are you trying to tell me something? He set down the pencil he'd been using to sketch out the framing. No, I'm just saying it might be good to have the space, in case we need it. She was quiet for a second, then she said, I'm not pregnant. I know. But you're thinking about it. I'm thinking it's a possibility. It is a possibility. She sat down next to him. Do you want it to be more than a possibility? He didn't know how to answer that. He'd never let himself think about children before. Not seriously. Not in any concrete way. Because thinking about children meant thinking about a future, and thinking about a future meant believing he had one. But now, with Marisol sitting next to him, wearing the ring he'd bought her, and talking about gardens and second bedrooms, the future didn't seem like a thing to be afraid of anymore. Yeah, he said. I do. She smiled. Then we should probably start trying. We've been trying. No, we've been having fun. Trying is different. Trying is intentional. What's the difference? I'll show you tonight. She did. By August, the new room was framed and roofed, and by September, it was finished. Elias built a shelf along one wall and a narrow bed along the other, and Marisol sewed curtains for the window out of fabric she'd bought on their last trip to town. They didn't put anything in it yet. It was just an empty room, waiting. But it was there, and that was enough. The garden kept producing. Marisol canned what they couldn't eat fresh, filling jar after jar with beans and carrots and beets, lining them up on the shelves in the root cellar Elias had dug years ago and never bothered to stock properly. By the time the first frost came in late September, they had enough put up to last the winter twice over. We're not going to starve this year, Marisol said, standing in the root cellar with her hands on her hips, looking at the rows of jars with the same satisfaction she'd had looking at the first radishes. We weren't going to starve anyway. No, but we're going to eat well. There's a difference. There was. Elias had spent the last 10 winters eating the same 5 things in rotation: venison, potatoes, cornbread, beans, and whatever jerky he'd managed to make in the fall. This year they had variety, they had flavor, they had vegetables that weren't potatoes, they had a life. One night in October, sitting by the stove after supper, Marisol said, "Do you remember what you said when I first got here? About why you kept writing to Mrs. Halverson?" I said, I didn't know what else to do. You said being alone was easy. Staying human was hard. She looked at him. Do you still think that? No. Why not? Because I'm not alone anymore. And staying human doesn't feel hard when you're here, she smiled. Good answer. It's the truth. I know. She reached over and took his hand. I'm glad you wrote that last letter. So am I. They sat there in the warm cabin with the stove ticking and the wind moving through the pines outside, and Elias thought about how different this was from a year ago. A year ago, he'd been alone, splitting wood on a Tuesday, waiting for the 7th woman to leave. Now he was married, and the cabin had an extra room, and the shelves were full, and the woman sitting next to him wasn't going anywhere. He'd stopped waiting for her to leave. Somewhere between the storm and the garden and the trip to Hollow Creek, he'd stopped waiting and started believing. She was staying, and he was going to make damn sure she never regretted it. In November, Caldwell's man came through with the mail, and there was a letter from Mrs. Halverson. Marisol opened it at the table while Elias fed the stove. What does it say? He said. She wants to know if we're doing all right, and she's offering to send another candidate if things didn't work out. What did you tell her last time? That I was staying, that you weren't looking. Marisol set the letter down. I'll write back and tell her the same thing, and I'll tell her we got married. You think she'll be surprised? Probably not. She strikes me as someone who's seen enough of these matches to know which ones are going to work and which ones aren't. She picked up the pencil. I'll write it now. She wrote the letter that afternoon, and Elias read it over her shoulder before she sealed it. Dear Mrs. Halverson, thank you for your letter. I wanted to let you know that Elias and I were married in May, and we're doing well. The cabin is solid, the winter stores are good, and we're building a life here that feels right. I know you've sent women to Elias before, and I know none of them stayed. I don't know their reasons, and I'm not going to judge them for leaving. This life isn't for everyone, but it's for me. And I wanted you to know that your work, matching people, giving them a chance, it matters. You gave Elias and me a chance, and we made something out of it. Thank you for that. Please take Elias off your list. He won't be needing your services anymore. Sincerely, Marisol Turner. Elias read it twice. Then he said, That's good? You think so? Yeah, it's honest. She'll appreciate that. Marisol sealed the letter and set it aside for Caldwell's man to pick up on his next run. Then she stood up and put her arms around Elias from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about them?" she said. "The other women?" "Sometimes." "Do you wonder what happened to them? Where they ended up?" "Sometimes," he said again, "but not as much as I used to." "Why not?" "Because it doesn't matter anymore. They left. You stayed. That's all I need to know." She kissed the side of his neck. "You're getting sentimental in your old age." "I'm 33. Like I said, old." He turned around and pulled her into his lap, and she laughed, and they sat there by the stove with the cabin warm around them and the future stretching out ahead of them. And for the first time in his life, Elias Turner felt like he'd done something right. December came, and with it the snow. It wasn't as bad as the storm that had come the year before, but it was steady, the kind of snow that fell for days without stopping and buried everything under a blanket of white that made the world look new. Elias and Marisol settled into the rhythm of winter, feeding the stock, keeping the paths clear, rationing the firewood, cooking meals from the jars in the root cellar. But this winter was different. This winter, Elias wasn't alone. This winter, he came in from the cold to a cabin that smelled like bread and coffee. This winter, he had someone to talk to, someone to sit with, someone to sleep next to. This winter, the work didn't feel like it was never going to end. It just felt like work. And this winter, Marisol told him she was pregnant. She told him on a Tuesday in mid-December, in the morning, standing at the stove with her back to him. "Elias," she said, "I need to tell you something." He looked up from the table where he'd been mending a harness strap. "What?" She turned around. She looked nervous, which was unusual for her, and that made him nervous too. "I'm pregnant," she said. He stared at her. For a second he didn't process the words, then he did, and he stood up so fast the chair nearly tipped over. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure. I've been sure for a couple of weeks, but I wanted to wait to tell you until I was certain." "You're certain?" "Yes." He crossed the room in 3 steps and put his hands on her shoulders. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "Are you sure?" "Elias, I'm pregnant, not dying. I'm fine." He pulled her into his arms and held her, and she held him back, and they stood there in the middle of the cabin for a long time without saying anything. When they finally pulled apart, Marisol was smiling. "You're happy," she said. "Yeah." "You don't look happy. You look terrified." "I'm both." She laughed. "Good. Me too." "When?" he said. "June. Maybe July." "That's—" He did the math in his head. "That's 6 months. 7, but close enough. We have to get ready. We have time. We need to make sure we have enough supplies. And we need to figure out where the baby's going to sleep. And we need to—" "Elias," she put her hand on his chest. "Breathe." He breathed. "We have time," she said again. "And we have everything we need. The cabin is solid. The stores are good. We have the extra room. We're ready. I don't know how to be a father, and I don't know how to be a mother. We'll figure it out together." She took his hand and put it on her stomach. There wasn't anything to feel yet, no roundness, no movement, but he left his hand there anyway. "This is what we've been building toward, Elias. A family, a life. This is it." He looked at her, at his wife, at the mother of his child, at the woman who'd shown up on his porch 8 months ago and decided to stay. And he felt something break open in his chest, something warm and terrifying and good. "I love you," he said. "I know." She smiled. "I love you too." The winter passed slowly, the way winters always did, but it didn't feel slow. Elias started preparing for the baby without entirely meaning to. He built a cradle out of pine and sanded it smooth. He reinforced the bed in the extra room and built a small dresser for clothes they didn't have yet. He made sure the stove was in good repair and the chimney was clean and the roof wasn't going to leak when the spring rains came. Marisol told him he was overdoing it. "The baby's not going to care if the chimney's clean," she said. "I care." "Why?" "Because I want everything to be right." "It's already right, Elias. The baby's not going to know the difference." "Maybe not, but I will." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You're going to be a good father." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." She put her hand on his arm. Because you care. Because you're already thinking about what the baby needs and how to keep them safe. That's what good fathers do. He didn't know if that was true, but he wanted to believe it. As the winter wore on, Marisol started to show. Not much at first, just a small roundness that she said felt strange, and then more, until by March she was visibly pregnant and moving a little slower and complaining about her back hurting. Elias did what he could. He took over the heavier work. He made sure she had enough to eat. He rubbed her back at night when it ached, and he didn't complain when she woke him up at odd hours because she couldn't sleep and wanted to talk. "Are you scared?" she asked him one night in early April, lying in bed with her hand on her stomach. "About what?" "The baby, labor, all of it." "Yeah, me too." "What are you scared of?" She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "I'm scared something's going to go wrong, that I'm going to die, or the baby's going to die, or both." "Women die in childbirth all the time, Elias. You know that." He did know that. His mother had died in childbirth, not his own, but the baby that would have been his younger brother, the one who'd been born blue and silent and had lived less than an hour. His mother had lasted 3 days after that, bleeding and feverish, and then she'd died too. He'd been 11. He remembered it. "You're not going to die," he said. "You can't promise that." "No, but I can be there, and I can get help if you need it. Caldwell's man knows a midwife in Hollow Creek. I'll get her up here before the baby comes." "What if she can't make it?" "Then we'll do it ourselves." "Elias, Marisol." He turned to face her. "I'm not going to let you die. I'm not going to let anything happen to you or the baby. I don't care what I have to do. I'll figure it out." She looked at him, and her eyes were wet, and she said, "Okay. Okay." She curled up against him, and he put his arm around her, and they lay there in the dark listening to the wind and the creak of the cabin and the sound of their own breathing, and Elias made a promise to himself that he was going to keep her safe, no matter what. Spring came, and with it the thaw. The snow melted, the creek ran high, and Marisol's belly got bigger. By May she was walking with one hand pressed to the small of her back, and by early June she was uncomfortable all the time, too big to move easily, too restless to sit still. Elias sent word to the midwife through Caldwell's man, and she came up the first week of June, a sturdy gray-haired woman named Mrs. Kovar, who looked at Marisol, looked at the cabin, and said, "You've got a good setup here. Clean, warm, that's half the battle." "What's the other half?" Marisol said. "Luck." Mrs. Kovar smiled. "But you look strong. I think you'll be fine." She stayed for 3 days, checking on Marisol, making sure everything was progressing the way it should, and then she went back down the mountain with instructions to send for her when the labor started. "It could be any day now," she said before she left. "Or it could be 2 weeks. Babies come when they come. Don't panic. Just send for me when the pains start, and I'll be back up as fast as I can." Elias sent for her 9 days later. The labor started just before dawn on a Thursday. Marisol woke him by gripping his arm hard enough to bruise, and when he sat up, she said through gritted teeth, "It's time." He got dressed faster than he'd ever gotten dressed in his life. He rode down to Hollow Creek himself, found Mrs. Kovar, and rode back with her, the whole trip taking just under 6 hours. By the time they got back to the cabin, Marisol was in full labor, pacing the main room with her hands on her stomach and her face pale with pain. Mrs. Kovar took over. She sent Elias outside to boil water and stay out of the way, and he did, pacing the clearing like a caged animal while the sun climbed higher and the hours dragged past. It was late afternoon when he heard the baby cry. He was at the door before he realized he'd moved, and Mrs. Kovar met him there with a bundle in her arms and a smile on her face. "You have a daughter," she said. Elias stared at the bundle. He couldn't see much, just a small red face and a tuft of dark hair, but it was enough. "Is Marisol all right?" he said. "She's fine. Tired, but fine. Go see her." He went inside. Marisol was in the bed, propped up on pillows, her hair damp with sweat, and her face exhausted, but smiling. Mrs. Kovar handed her the baby, and Marisol looked down at it with an expression Elias had never seen before, soft and fierce at the same time. "Come here," she said. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and Marisol shifted the baby so he could see her properly. She was tiny. Impossibly tiny. Her eyes were closed and her fists were clenched, and she was making small, snuffling noises that might have been the best sounds Elias had ever heard. "What do you think?" Marisol said. "She's perfect." "She is, isn't she?" Marisol looked up at him. "Do you want to hold her?" "I don't know how." "You'll learn." She handed him the baby, and he took her carefully, terrified he was going to drop her, or hurt her, or do something wrong. But the baby just settled into his arms like she belonged there, and Elias looked down at his daughter and felt the last piece of something inside him slot into place. "What are we going to name her?" he said. Marisol smiled. "I was thinking Clara, after my mother. Clara Turner. Do you like it?" "I love it." The baby, Clara, opened her eyes for just a second, and they were dark, like Marisol's, and then she closed them again and went to sleep. Elias sat there holding his daughter, and Marisol leaned her head against his shoulder, and Mrs. Kovar moved quietly around the cabin, making tea and tidying up, and outside the sun started to set over the ridge, turning the sky gold and pink and purple, and Elias thought, "This is what I've been building toward, this moment, this family, this life, not survival, not loneliness, not the cold, empty years of waiting for something to change. This." Mrs. Kovar stayed for 3 days, teaching them how to care for Clara, how to swaddle her, how to tell when she was hungry, how to clean her, how to soothe her when she cried. On the morning of the 4th day, she packed her bag and stood on the porch with Elias, while Marisol nursed the baby inside. "You're going to be fine," Mrs. Kovar said. "You sure about that? I've seen a lot of new parents in my time, Mr. Turner. Most of them are terrified, but the ones who do best are the ones who figure out that there's no perfect way to do this. There's just your way. And as long as you love that baby and keep her fed and warm and safe, your way will be good enough." Elias looked back through the open door at Marisol sitting in the rocking chair he'd built last month, Clara in her arms, both of them bathed in morning light. "I don't want to mess this up," he said. "You won't." "How do you know?" "Because you care enough to worry about it." She picked up her bag. "That's more than a lot of fathers can say." She left after that, riding down the mountain on the horse Elias had saddled for her, and Elias stood on the porch and watched her go until she disappeared around the first bend in the trail. Then he went back inside. Marisol looked up when he came in. "She's asleep," she whispered. "Good. Are you scared?" "Terrified." "Me too," she smiled. "But we'll figure it out." That's what Mrs. Kovar said. Then it must be true. But the first weeks with Clara were harder than anything Elias had done on the mountain, and he'd survived blizzards and wolves and winters that had killed stronger men than him. The baby cried. She cried at night when they were trying to sleep. She cried during the day when they were trying to work. She cried for reasons they could identify: hunger, cold, a soiled diaper. And she cried for reasons they couldn't: long, inconsolable wails that made Elias feel helpless and useless, and like he was failing at the most important job he'd ever had. Marisol handled it better than he did, mostly because she had to. She was the one feeding Clara, the one getting up every 2 hours through the night, the one whose body was still recovering from labor. Elias did what he could: changed diapers, rocked the baby when Marisol needed a break, took over the cooking and cleaning, but there were things only Marisol could do, and he hated watching her exhaust herself while he stood by feeling useless. One night, about 3 weeks after Clara was born, Elias woke to find Marisol sitting in the rocking chair in the main room, crying. Not the baby. Marisol. Clara was asleep in the cradle next to her, and Marisol was sitting there with her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Elias got out of bed and went to her. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." "Marisol." "I'm fine." "You're crying." "I know." She wiped her face with the heel of her hand. "I'm just tired, that's all." "When's the last time you slept more than 2 hours?" "I don't know. A week ago? Maybe more." He crouched down in front of her. "You need to rest." "I can't. Clara needs me. Clara's asleep, and I'm here. I can watch her." "What if she wakes up?" "Then I'll come get you. But right now, you need to go to bed." She looked at him, and her eyes were red and exhausted, and she looked like she was going to argue. Then she didn't. She just nodded and stood up and went to the bedroom, and Elias heard the bed creak as she lay down. He sat in the rocking chair and watched Clara sleep. She was so small. Her whole fist could fit inside his palm, Her breathing was soft and shallow, and every few minutes she'd make a little sound. Not quite a cry, not quite a sigh, and shift in her sleep. She woke up an hour later crying. Elias picked her up and tried to soothe her, but she just cried harder. He checked her diaper. Dry. He tried rocking her. She kept crying. He tried singing to her, which felt ridiculous, but he did it anyway, some old song his mother used to hum that he barely remembered the words to. Clara stopped crying, not immediately, but gradually, her wails tapering off into hiccups and then into silence. She looked up at him with those dark eyes that were starting to focus now, and he looked back, and something passed between them that he couldn't name but could feel. He kept singing, just humming really, and she stayed quiet, and after a while her eyes drifted closed and she fell back asleep in his arms. When Marisol came out 2 hours later, looking more rested than she had in weeks, she found Elias still in the rocking chair with Clara asleep on his chest. "You got her to sleep," she said. "Eventually." "How?" "I sang to her." Marisol smiled. "You sang?" "Don't make fun of me." "I'm not. I think it's sweet." She came over and kissed the top of his head. "Thank you." "For what?" "For letting me sleep, for taking care of her, for being here. Where else would I be?" "I don't know, but some men would have left by now. This is hard, Elias. Harder than I thought it would be. And you're still here." He looked up at her. "I'm not going anywhere." "I know, but it's good to hear you say it." "What?" Summer came in warm and bright, and the garden that Marisol had planted the year before came back fuller and stronger. She couldn't tend it the way she had before, not with Clara to care for, so Elias took over most of it, weeding and watering and harvesting while Marisol sat in the shade with the baby and told him what to do. "The beans need more water," she'd say, or "You missed a weed by the carrots," and Elias would do what she said without arguing because he'd learned that Marisol knew what she was doing and he didn't. Clara grew. By 2 months she was smiling. By 3 months she was laughing, a bright gurgling sound that made both of them stop whatever they were doing just to hear it again. By 4 months she was starting to notice the world around her, the way the light moved through the window, the way the chickens clucked in the yard, the way Elias's voice sounded different from Marisol's. She looked like Marisol. Same dark eyes, same dark hair, same serious expression when she was concentrating on something. But she had Elias's stubbornness. Once she decided she wanted something, a toy, attention, to be picked up, she would not stop fussing until she got it. "She's going to be a handful," Marisol said one afternoon, watching Clara grab at the wooden rattle Elias had carved for her. "She already is. I mean, when she's older, when she starts walking, talking, making decisions. You think we'll be able to handle it?" "I don't know, but we'll try." She looked at him. "That's all we can do, right? Try and hope it's enough." "It'll be enough." "You sound sure." "I am sure. Look at what we've already done. A year and a half ago, I was alone up here, convinced nobody would ever stay. Now I'm married with a daughter and a garden that actually grows things. If we can do that, we can handle whatever Clara throws at us." Marisol smiled. "You're getting optimistic in your old age." "I'm 34. Like I said, old, long." By the time fall came around again, Clara was 6 months old and sitting up on her own. Elias built her a little chair at the table so she could sit with them during meals, even though she wasn't eating solid food yet. She'd sit there and bang on the table with her hands and babble while they ate, and Marisol would talk to her like she understood every word. "That's right, Clara. Daddy's eating stew." "Can you say stew? Stew." "She can't talk yet," Elias said. "Not yet, but she will. And when she does, her first word is going to be something good. Not no or mine, something like mama or daddy or stew. If her first word is stew, I'm blaming you." Clara laughed, and they both stopped to look at her, and Elias thought about how different this was from last year. Last year he'd been preparing for another hard winter alone, stockpiling wood and food, and trying not to think about the fact that he was going to spend 5 months in silence. This year he was preparing for a winter with his wife and daughter, and the cabin felt full in a way it never had before. One evening in late October, after Clara had been put to bed and the dishes were washed and the stove was fed, Marisol said, "We should start thinking about teaching her things. She's 6 months old." "I know, but she's watching everything we do. She's learning already, and I want to make sure we're teaching her the right things." "Like what?" "Like how to work, how to be strong. how to take care of herself. Marisol sat down at the table. I don't want her to grow up thinking the world is going to take care of her. I want her to know she has to take care of herself, and I want her to know she can. She'll know. She's got you as a mother, and you as a father. She reached across the table and took his hand. You're going to teach her things too, Elias, how to fix things, how to survive up here, how to be strong without being hard. I don't know if I know how to do that last one. You do. You just don't realize it. She squeezed his hand. You were hard when I met you, closed off, afraid, but you're not anymore. You've softened, not in a bad way, in a good way, in a way that makes you a better man. He didn't know what to say to that, so he just squeezed her hand back and hoped it was enough. That winter was the coldest one in 5 years. The snow started in November and didn't stop until March. The temperature dropped so low that the water in the basin froze solid every night, and the wind came down off the ridge so hard it rattled the windows and made the cabin groan. Elias worked twice as hard to keep them all warm and fed, chopping wood until his shoulders screamed, hauling water from the spring until his hands were raw, checking the stock in weather so cold it hurt to breathe. But it didn't break him, because every time he came inside, Marisol was there with hot coffee and a warm meal, and Clara was there with her bright laugh and her reaching hands, and the cabin was full of life and noise and warmth. One night in January, during the worst of the cold, the stove started acting up. The fire wouldn't draw properly, and smoke backed up into the cabin, and within minutes the whole room was hazy and both of them were coughing. We need to put it out, Marisol said, covering Clara's face with a cloth. If we put it out, we'll freeze. If we don't, we'll suffocate. Elias grabbed a bucket and doused the fire, and the cabin went dark and the temperature started dropping immediately. He grabbed a lantern and went outside to check the chimney. It took him 20 minutes in the freezing wind to find the problem, a bird's nest that had somehow gotten lodged in the flue, and another 20 to clear it out. By the time he came back inside, his hands were numb and his face felt like ice. But the chimney was clear. He rebuilt the fire, and this time it drew properly, and within an hour the cabin was warm again. Marisol wrapped him in a blanket and made him sit by the stove while she heated water for tea. You could have frozen out there, she said. But I didn't. Elias, this isn't a joke. You could have died. But I didn't. And now we have heat, and we're all fine. He pulled her down to sit next to him. This is what I do, Marisol. I fix things. I keep us safe. That's my job. Your job is also to stay alive. Clara needs you. I need you. I know, and I'm not going anywhere. He put his arm around her. I promise. She leaned against him, and they sat there by the stove, and Clara slept in her cradle a few feet away. And outside the wind howled and the snow fell, and the mountain did what it always did, which was test them and try to break them and fail. But spring came again, slower this time, reluctant. The snow didn't melt until April, and even then the ground stayed frozen for another 2 weeks. But eventually the ice broke on the creek, and the first green shoots appeared in the garden, and Marisol started talking about what she wanted to plant this year. Clara was almost a year old now. She'd started crawling in February, and by March she was pulling herself up on furniture and taking a few wobbly steps before falling down. Marisol said she'd be walking by summer, and Elias believed her, because Clara had that same determined look Marisol got when she'd decided to do something. One afternoon in late April, Elias was in the shed repairing a harness when he heard voices in the clearing. He stepped outside and saw a wagon coming up the trail. Not Caldwell's man, who wasn't due for another week, but someone else. He walked out to meet it, and as the wagon got closer, he recognized the driver. It was Pritchard, the minister from Hollow Creek, and sitting next to him was a young couple Elias didn't know. Pritchard pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. Mr. Turner, good to see you. Reverend, what brings you up here? Business, actually. Pritchard gestured to the couple. This is Michael and Sarah Brennan. They're looking to homestead in the area, and I told them they should talk to you first. The young man, Michael, climbed down from the wagon and stuck out his hand. Mr. Turner, we've heard you've been up here a long time. We were hoping you might have some advice. Elias shook his hand and looked at the woman, Sarah, who was still in the wagon, looking around at the clearing and the cabin and the mountains beyond with an expression that was equal parts nervous and excited. Advice about what? Elias said. About surviving up here. About making it work. Michael looked back at his wife, then at Elias. We're newlyweds. We don't know what we're doing yet, but we want to try. Elias studied them. They were young, younger than he and Marisol had been when they'd started. They looked soft, like they'd come from a city or at least from somewhere easier than this. But they also looked determined, and that counted for something. Marisol came out of the cabin with Clara on her hip. Elias? Who's this? Michael and Sarah Brennan. They're thinking about homesteading nearby. Marisol came down from the porch and looked at the couple with the same assessing gaze she'd given the mountain when she'd first arrived. How nearby? There's a plot about 2 miles east, Michael said. Down by the lower creek. It's got good water and decent timber. It's also got poor drainage, and the south slope gets hit hard by avalanches in the spring, Elias said. You'd be better off looking at the ridge on the other side. It's rockier, but it's safer. Michael nodded, pulling out a small notebook and scribbling something down. Anything else we should know? Elias looked at Marisol. She looked back at him with a small smile that said, "This is your call." Yeah, plus, Elias said. A few things. Stock up on supplies in the fall, more than you think you need. The first winter is going to be harder than you expect. Build your cabin solid. No shortcuts, or you'll pay for it later. Don't try to do everything yourself. If you need help, ask for it. And he paused, looking at Sarah, who was watching him with wide, serious eyes. Make sure you're both committed. This life isn't for everyone. And if one of you wants out, there's no shame in that. But figure it out early, before you've put down roots you can't pull up. Sarah spoke for the first time. Did you have doubts when you started? All the time. Do you still? Elias looked at Marisol, at Clara reaching out to grab a fistful of her mother's hair, at the cabin behind them that he'd built with his own hands, and that was now full of more life than he'd ever thought possible. No, he said, not anymore. Sarah smiled. Then there's hope for us too. They stayed for a little while longer, asking questions about where to buy supplies and who to talk to about timber rights and what kind of stock did best up here. Marisol invited them in for coffee, and they sat at the table while Clara played on the floor, and Elias found himself talking more than he had to strangers in years, telling them things he'd learned the hard way, so maybe they wouldn't have to. When they finally left, heading back down the trail with Pritchard, Marisol stood next to Elias on the porch and said, "That was good of you." What was? Helping them. Sharing what you know. It's just common sense. No, it's more than that. It's community. It's making sure they don't have to do this alone the way you did. She shifted Clara to her other hip. Do you think they'll make it? I don't know. Maybe. What are their odds? He thought about it. Better than mine were. They have each other. They're asking questions. They're not too proud to take help. He put his arm around Marisol. And they're not doing it alone. Summer came in hot and dry. The garden grew, the stock multiplied, and Clara took her first real steps in early June, walking from Marisol to Elias across the cabin floor with her arms out for balance and a look of intense concentration on her face. When she reached him, he picked her up and swung her around, and she laughed so hard she got the hiccups. She's walking, Marisol said. I see that. She's going to be into everything now. I know. We're going to have to watch her every second. I know. But Elias was smiling because Clara walking meant she was growing, and growing meant she was thriving, and thriving meant they were doing something right. The Brennans came by twice that summer, once in June to show Elias the cabin they'd started building, and once in August to borrow tools and ask more questions. They were making progress. Slow progress, but progress. And they hadn't given up yet, which was more than a lot of people could say. The second time they came, Sarah was pregnant. Due in February, she told Marisol while the men talked outside. I'm terrified. I was too. Does it get easier? Marisol looked at Clara, who was sitting on the floor banging 2 wooden spoons together. No, but you figure it out. And it's worth it. Sarah nodded. That's what I'm hoping. When the Brennans left that day, Elias watched them go and thought about how strange it was that he was the one giving advice now, that he was the old hand, the one who'd been here long enough to know things. 2 years ago, he'd been the one asking questions and getting turned away. Now he was the one answering them. You ever think about how much has changed? Marisol said that night, lying in bed with Clara asleep in the cradle next to them. all the time. Do you miss it the way it was before? Before you? Yeah. He thought about it honestly. He thought about the silence, the empty cabin, the years of splitting wood and running traps and eating the same 5 meals in rotation. He thought about standing on the porch watching women leave, one after another, until he'd stopped believing anyone would stay. No, he said, I don't miss it at all. Good. She turned to face him. Because I'm not going anywhere. I know. Do you? Really? Yeah, I do. He put his hand on her face. You told me once that I needed to stop waiting for you to leave and start believing you were going to stay. I believe it now. I believe you. She smiled. It only took you 2 years. I'm a slow learner. You're learning. That's what matters. Fall came, and with it, the preparations for another winter. But this year was different. This year, they weren't just preparing for themselves. They were preparing for Clara, who was going to be a year and a half old by the time the snow came, who was going to need more food and more warmth and more attention than she had last year. They stocked up on supplies. They reinforced the cabin. They made sure the stove was in perfect working order and the chimney was clean and the roof wasn't going to leak. They did everything they'd done every other year, but they did it with more care, more attention, more focus. Because they weren't just surviving anymore. They were protecting something. They were building something that mattered. One evening in late September, sitting on the porch after Clara had gone to bed, Marisol said, Do you ever think about having another one? Another what? Another baby. Elias looked at her. Do you want another one? I don't know. Maybe. Eventually. She was quiet for a second. I like our family the way it is. But I also think Clara might like having a brother or sister. We could barely handle 1 baby. You think we can handle 2? We're handling 1 fine now, and we're better at it than we were. So yeah, I think we could handle 2, if we wanted to. Do you want to? I'm asking you. He thought about it. He thought about the sleepless nights and the constant work and the feeling of being overwhelmed that had defined the first 6 months of Clara's life. He thought about how hard it had been and how scared he'd been, and how many times he'd been convinced he was doing everything wrong. Then he thought about Clara's laugh, about her first steps, about the way she looked at him when he picked her up, like he was the most important person in her world. Yeah, he said, I do. Marisol smiled. Good. Then we'll see what happens. Cuts. Winter came again, and it was hard, but not as hard as the one before. They'd learned things. They'd figured out how to keep Clara warm without overheating her, how to keep her entertained when they couldn't go outside, how to work around her naps and her meals and her moods. They'd figured out how to be parents, not perfectly, but well enough. And they'd figured out how to be partners. Real partners. Not just 2 people living in the same space, but 2 people building something together, making decisions together, carrying the weight together. One night in January, during a storm that kept them inside for 3 days straight, Elias woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't fall back asleep. He got up quietly, trying not to wake Marisol, and went to the main room. Clara was awake too, standing up in her cradle and holding onto the edge, looking at him with those serious dark eyes. You can't sleep either, he whispered. She reached out her arms. He picked her up and sat down in the rocking chair, and she settled against his chest the way she always did, warm and solid and real. He rocked slowly, listening to the wind outside and the creak of the cabin and Clara's soft breathing. He thought about the 7 women who'd left, about Gerda and Constance and Mary Beth and all the others whose names he could barely remember now. He thought about how he'd stood on this porch and watched them go, convinced that he was unlovable, that the mountain was too much, that he was going to die alone up here. He'd been wrong about all of it. The mountain wasn't too much. He wasn't unlovable, and he wasn't going to die alone. He had a wife who'd chosen him, who'd stayed when staying was hard, who'd looked at this life and decided it was worth building. He had a daughter who looked at him like he hung the moon. He had a cabin that was warm and solid and full. He had a future that stretched out ahead of him, not empty and gray, but full of possibility. He'd built this. Not alone, not anymore, but he'd built it. And it was good. Clara fell asleep in his arms, and Elias kept rocking, kept holding her, kept sitting in the dark cabin while the storm raged outside. And he thought about how strange it was that the thing he'd been searching for all those years, connection, family, belonging, had been right there the whole time, waiting for him to stop running from it and start building toward it. Marisol found him there an hour later, still rocking, still holding Clara. "You should be asleep," she whispered. "I know. I couldn't." "Bad dreams?" "No. Good thoughts." She smiled. "Want to share?" "I was thinking about how lucky I am." "Yeah?" "Yeah." He looked up at her. "I was thinking about how I spent 10 years up here alone, convinced nobody would stay. And then you showed up and proved me wrong about everything." "I didn't prove you wrong. I just showed you what was possible if you let it be." "Same thing." "Not really." She sat down on the arm of the rocking chair. "You built this cabin. You survived up here when most people would have given up. You did that alone, Elias. I didn't do it for you. I just showed up and decided to stay." "Why did you stay?" "You know why." "Tell me anyway." She was quiet for a second, then she said, "Because you let me. Because you didn't try to change me or break me or make me into something I wasn't. Because you saw me for who I was and decided that was enough." She reached out and touched his face. "And because I saw you for who you were, and I decided that was enough too." He kissed her, careful not to wake Clara, and when they pulled apart, Marisol said, "Come back to bed." "In a minute." "Elias, I just want to sit here a little longer with her. Is that all right?" Marisol looked at him, at Clara asleep in his arms, at the way he was holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "Yeah," she said softly. "That's all right." She went back to bed, and Elias sat there in the dark, rocking his daughter, listening to the storm, thinking about the future. And for the first time in his entire life, he wasn't afraid of it. Yeah. Spring came again, and with it, new life. The Brennans had their baby in February, a boy they named Thomas. Sarah nearly died in the delivery, but Mrs. Kovar had been there and had known what to do, and in the end, both mother and baby survived. Elias and Marisol went down to see them a week after the birth, bringing food and supplies and advice. "It gets easier," Marisol told Sarah, who looked exhausted and overwhelmed and like she might cry at any moment. "When?" "I'll let you know when I figure it out." Sarah laughed, and some of the tension went out of her shoulders, and Elias saw the same thing he'd seen in Marisol 2 years ago. A woman who was scared but determined, who was in over her head but not ready to give up. They were going to make it, he thought, the Brennans. They were going to be all right. On the way back up the mountain, with Clara asleep in Marisol's lap, Elias said, "We should do that more." "Do what?" "Help people. The Brennans or anyone else who comes up here. We know how to do this now. We should share it." "You want to become the welcome committee for Crowfoot Ridge?" "Something like that." He looked at her. "We were alone up here for so long. Both of us, in different ways. I don't want other people to have to be that alone if they don't have to be." Marisol smiled. "I think that's a good idea." "Yeah?" "Yeah, we'll be the grumpy mountain couple who tells everyone their cabin's in the wrong place and they're not ready for winter." "We're not grumpy." "You're a little grumpy." "I'm practical." "Same thing." She leaned against him. "But I love you anyway." By the time summer came around again, Clara was 2 years old and talking in full sentences. Her first word had not been stew, to Marisol's relief and Elias's disappointment. It had been mama, followed quickly by dada, and then no, which became her favorite word for about 3 months. She was curious about everything. She wanted to know how things worked, why the chickens made that noise, where the sun went at night, why the snow melted. Elias answered her questions as best he could, and when he didn't know the answer, he told her so, and she seemed to accept that. She followed him everywhere. When he worked in the garden, she worked next to him, pulling up weeds he'd already pulled and getting dirt all over herself. When he chopped wood, she sat on the porch and watched, asking him to do it again every time the axe came down. When he went to check the traps, she wanted to come too, and sometimes he let her, carrying her on his shoulders and pointing out tracks in the snow. "She's going to be like you," Marisol said one evening, watching Clara toddle around the cabin with a piece of wood she'd claimed as her own, trying to fit it into places it didn't belong. "Like me how?" "Stubborn, independent, good with her hands." "Is that a good thing?" "It's a good thing. As long as she's also a little like me." "What's that?" "Smart enough to know when to ask for help." Elias smiled. "She'll be both. She's got good teachers." "Not." By the end of that summer, Marisol was pregnant again. She told him in August, the same way she'd told him the first time, standing at the stove with her back to him, saying it like it was a fact and not a miracle. "I'm pregnant," she said. He set down the harness he'd been mending. "You sure?" "I'm sure." He got up and crossed the room and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him, and they stood there for a long time without saying anything. "You happy?" she said finally. "Yeah." "Scared?" "A little." "Me too." She turned around in his arms. "But we did it once. We can do it again." "Yeah, we can." And they did. The second baby, a boy they named James, was born the following April, 3 weeks early and loud as hell from the moment he took his first breath. The labor was faster than Clara's had been, and easier, and when Mrs. Kovar handed Elias his son, all red-faced and squalling, Elias felt the same thing he'd felt when Clara was born. That sense of something clicking into place, of the world making sense in a way it hadn't before. Clara was not impressed. "Baby loud," she said, frowning at her new brother. "He'll quiet down eventually," Marisol said. "When?" "I'll let you know when I figure it out." But Clara warmed up to him eventually, the way children do. By the time James was 2 months old, she was helping, or trying to help, bringing him toys, singing to him in her off-key toddler voice, patting his head with more force than was probably advisable. "Gentle," Marisol would say, and Clara would nod seriously and then immediately forget and pat him again. Elias watched his family grow, watched the cabin fill up with noise and mess and life, and he thought about how impossible this would have seemed 5 years ago. 5 years ago, he'd been alone, writing letters to a broker in Denver, hoping somebody, anybody, would stay. Now he had more than he'd ever dreamed of asking for. The years passed the way years do in the mountains, slowly in the winters, quickly in the summers, marked by the work that needed doing and the seasons that kept turning. Clara grew into a serious, thoughtful child who asked questions faster than Elias could answer them and who followed him around like a shadow, learning everything he had to teach. James grew into a loud, fearless child who climbed things he shouldn't and laughed when he fell and wanted to do everything his older sister did. The cabin expanded again. Another room, then another. A bigger porch, a second shed, a proper barn for the stock. It grew the way a family grows, not all at once, but piece by piece, year by year, built by hands that knew how to work and hearts that knew how to stay. The Brennans stayed. They built their cabin and had another baby, a girl they named Ruth, and they became the kind of neighbors Elias had never had before, the kind who showed up when you needed help, who borrowed tools and returned them, who sat at your table and talked about crops and weather and the ordinary concerns of people who decided to make a life in a hard place. Other families came too. Not many, but enough. Enough that Crowfoot Ridge didn't feel quite so empty anymore. Enough that when Elias went to town twice a year for supplies, he saw familiar faces, people who knew his name and asked about Marisol and the kids. He was part of something now. Not just a man alone on a mountain, but part of a community, part of a network of people who'd all chosen the same hard life and who helped each other survive it. And through it all, Marisol stayed. She stayed through the winters and the storms and the times when money was tight and the times when Elias was sure they weren't going to make it through. She stayed when Clara was sick with fever and they didn't know if she'd pull through, and when James broke his arm falling out of a tree and had to ride down to Hollow Creek to have it set. She stayed when things were hard and when things were good and when things were just ordinary. She stayed because she'd chosen this, not because she had to, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this was where she wanted to be, and that made all the difference. On a cold evening in late November, almost 7 years after Marisol had first arrived, Elias came in from chopping wood to find her sitting at the table with a letter in her hand. "What's that?" he said. "It's from Mrs. Halverson." He set down the axe. "I thought we told her to stop writing." "We did. This isn't about a match, it's something else." She handed him the letter. He read it. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Turner, I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing to let you know that I am retiring from the matchmaking business. My health is not what it once was, and I have decided it is time to step back. In going through my files, I came across your correspondence, and I wanted to write to you one last time. In my 30 years of making matches, I have seen many successes and many failures. Yours is one of the successes I am most proud of. When Marisol came to me asking to be sent to a homestead, I was skeptical. She was too old, too plain, too set in her ways. But there was something in her eyes that told me she knew what she wanted. And when I read your file, Mr. Turner, I saw a man who had been failed 7 times, but who was still willing to try once more. I thought perhaps you deserved each other. I am gratified to learn that I was right. I wish you both and your children every happiness. Yours in good faith, for the last time, H. Halverson. Elias set the letter down. He looked at Marisol. She was right, he said. About what? That we deserved each other. Marisol smiled. We did. We do. She stood up and put her arms around him. We built something good here, Elias. We did. And it's going to last. How do you know? Because we're still here. Because we didn't give up. Because we chose this every day, even when it was hard. She kissed him. That's how things last. Not because they're easy, but because you decide they're worth it. He held her, and through the window he could see Clara and James playing in the snow, their voices carrying on the cold air, and he thought about all the years that had brought him to this moment. The years alone, the years of failure, the years of learning how to let someone stay. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been perfect, but it had been worth it, every single day of it. And he knew, standing there with his wife in his arms and his children playing outside and the cabin warm around them, that this was what he'd been building toward all along. Not survival, not solitude, but this, a family, a home, a life built on choice and work and the simple, stubborn refusal to give up. The mountain was still there. It would always be there, cold and hard and unforgiving. But it wasn't empty anymore, and neither was he.